Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world of candle wax, creaky floorboards, and really awkward family involvement. The year is somewhere in the late 1200s, and you're standing in an itchy wool tunic in front of a drafty stone church, wondering if your future spouse is going to smell like onions or incense. Around you, people are humming, chanting, spilling ale, and dropping crumbs down their embroidered collars. It's your wedding day, and your wedding night is just around the corner. But don't get too excited, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also tell me your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing who's tuning in from under how many blankets. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bells have rung, the priest mumbled his blessings over your joined hands. A pig squealed in the distance, hopefully not a metaphor, and your village neighbours let out a cheer that sounds like someone choking on soup. You're married now? Congratulations! And by congratulations, I mean you're about to be escorted by a slow-moving, nosy crowd through the mucky town square to the bridal chamber, while everyone tries not to trip on their own enthusiasm. You're walking slowly, candlelight flickering off the uneven cobblestones as a cluster of relatives, townsfolk, and that one guy who always wants to start a conga line follows you with a mixture of genuine joy and morbid curiosity. There's a band playing, if you can call two fiddlers, and a drum made from goat bladder a band. The tune is lurching and off-key, but everyone is tapping their feet. Even your grandmother, who's seen 5 plagues and 3 harvest famines, has a twinkle in her eye. It's not romantic, it's ceremonial, because the Middle Ages didn't leave intimacy to the imagination, they made it a group activity. You try to focus on your steps. Don't trip, don't laugh, don't let your eyes meet the uncle who keeps winking at you like he knows something. The groom, nervous, flushed, and possibly slightly drunk, is squeezing your hand like it's the only anchor in a world that just got much more complicated. You're both pretending this is perfectly normal, because it is. This parade of awkwardness is what everyone expects. And if you show even the slightest hint of hesitation, people might start whispering about curses, or impotence, or that old family rumor about the goat-born child. The path winds through narrow lanes between stone cottages and timbered inns, the windows glowing orange with firelight. Somewhere, a dog barks and is promptly shushed by a stick. People are throwing flower petals, or possibly just whatever was growing near the outhouse. The air smells of wet hay, roasted meat, and anticipation. You catch a glimpse of the moon peeking through clouds like it's watching with barely concealed pity. Finally, you arrive at the house. Not your house, technically. If you're noble, it's a manor. If you're peasant, it's a one-room dwelling with a suspicious draft and maybe a chicken or two roosting in the rafters. Either way, it has a bed, or something pretending to be one, and tonight, that bed is the main character. As you step through the threshold, people start singing. Not ballads, not lullabies. These are wedding night chants, half prayers, half teasing songs meant to encourage fertility and make everyone uncomfortable. One verse is literally about ploughing the blessed field, which you try not to think too hard about. A woman tosses a sprig of rosemary over your shoulder for luck, and a child offers you a clove of garlic for protection. You're not sure if it's for you or the sheets. Inside, the chamber is warm from the fire, and herbs hang from the ceiling like upside-down bouquets. The bed is decorated with embroidered linens, stuffed with goose down, and surrounded by candles. There are slippers by the bed. One is already singed. You don't ask why. Outside, your guests are not leaving. Oh no, they are gathering beneath the window, because the parade may be over, but the spectators are staying until the final act. Here's the quirky tidbit. In many medieval cultures, including parts of France and England, the bedding ceremony was public, or at least witnessed. This wasn't just some folkloric tale. There were written records. The newlyweds were expected to be walked to their chamber, undressed by attendants. Yes, seriously? and tucked into bed under the watchful eyes of family and clergy. The logic? Prove the marriage was consummated, therefore legal and binding. Historians still argue whether this practice was common across all social classes or limited to the elite. Some claim it was more symbolic than literal. Others say, no, people stayed and literally listened for body signs of success. Some even knocked for updates. Privacy was not a medieval luxury, it was a suspicious behavior. You sit on the edge of the bed, your groom looks around helplessly, as if someone might provide a user manual. The crowd outside begins to quiet. That is somehow worse, and now you wait. Because this isn't a private moment, it's a performance with an invisible curtain and an audience that might throw cabbages if you disappoint. The candle sputters, the floor creaks. Somewhere downstairs, someone is opening a bottle of mead and toasting to your joyous union. You try to remember the herbal advice whispered by your aunt, the one who claimed to have outlived 4 husbands and once cursed a man using only fennel and a dirty look. This is your wedding night in the Middle Ages. A procession through public expectation, superstition, and absolutely no personal space. Romantic? Not quite. Memorable? Definitely. And as you finally pull the covers over yourself, the weight of centuries of tradition settles around you like an extra quilt, scratchy, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The door clicks shut behind you, though not for long. It opens again almost immediately to admit 3 older women, your new mother-in-law, a cousin who seems far too enthusiastic, and someone referred to only as the wise widow. They're here to prepare the bridal chamber, not emotionally, logistically. Because apparently nothing says sacred union like a room full of bustling matrons fluffing pillows and muttering about goose feathers and fertility. You sit frozen on the edge of the mattress as the women circle like holy bees. One of them pulls out a bundle of dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, and something that smells strongly of feet, but is declared very potent by the widow. She crumbles the bundle into a bowl and tosses bits of it into the 4 corners of the room, mumbling a half-prayer, half-poem in Latin. At least you think it's Latin. It might just be old gossip set to rhyme. The bed itself is the main attraction, a towering structure of wood and stuffed linen, canopied with dusty curtains that haven't been washed since someone crowned a pope. The mattress is stuffed with straw and goose feathers and sounds like it might honk if you sit down too hard. Your groom tests it by leaning and immediately disappears halfway into the middle. That's fine, you weren't planning to move for a while anyway. The wise widow, clearly the director of tonight's domestic opera, demands a ribbon. No one questions her. The cousin produces a blue one from her sleeve. It's your garter, actually, and the widow ties it around the nearest bedpost while declaring this an ancient symbol of union and something else she trails off on while adjusting the chamber pot. Let's pause here for one mainstream fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly among nobles, the bridal bed was ritually blessed before the couple lay in it. This could involve anything from priests sprinkling holy water on the sheets to the burning of aromatic herbs to ward off spirits, curses, and ex-lovers. Sometimes the couple's parents took turns sitting on the bed to pass on fertility. If you're thinking, that's weird, yes. Yes, it is. But to them, conception was communal business, both spiritually and politically. You weren't just expected to produce children. You were expected to do so with divine approval and a full supporting cast. Now someone is stuffing rosemary under the mattress. It keeps the womb open, the mother-in-law explains. You nod slowly as if your womb were a suspicious cellar door rather than an organ. Meanwhile, your groom's expression has shifted from eager to overwhelmed. He's attempting to help by lighting a candle and instead drops wax on his boot. A small yelp, a slap to his own ankle, and he's seated again, red-faced and blinking. The room begins to smell like a mix of burning herbs, damp fabric, and centuries of expectations. It is, if we're being honest, kind of cozy if you ignore the fact that everything about tonight is being choreographed like a village fair, and you are the main event, a fringe tidbit for you. In some households, especially in Germany and the Low Countries, Feathers weren't just used for stuffing pillows, they were chosen based on their symbolism. White goose feathers for peace and fidelity, duck feathers for fertility, swans for loyalty, and crows never. Crows meant doom. If anyone finds a black feather in the bedding, you can expect a very dramatic gasp and possibly a quick trip to the nearest priest. You look around. No black feathers, just a suspicious number of dried apples hanging from strings over the window. For sweetness, someone explains before you can ask. Now comes the final step, the closing of the curtains. This is done with what can only be described as theatrical reverence. The cousin tugs them shut with a whoosh that sends a cloud of dust puffing into the air, and the chamber dims to a flickering amber glow. The three women retreat slowly, like they've just sealed you in a tomb. But one pauses at the doorway. "Remember," she says with a wink, "don't let your left foot touch the floor first in the morning. It'll ruin the whole marriage." You don't ask questions, you just nod. Once they're gone, the room feels too quiet. The crowd outside is still murmuring, probably playing dice games over whether or not you'll cry. The bed creaks as your groom shifts his weight. He opens his mouth, perhaps to say something tender and comforting, but instead lets out a deep, nervous hiccup. You both laugh. It's awkward, but honest. Historians still argue whether these pre-wedding night rituals were more theatrical tradition or genuine belief. Some claim the blessings were just symbolic, rituals done more out of habit than true faith. Others insist the anxiety over fertility, evil spirits, and divine favor was deadly serious. You, currently trying to adjust your linen nightshirt while also navigating goose-feather quicksand, are leaning toward the latter. A draft creeps in through the shuttered window, and the candle nearest the bed flickers violently. Your husband grabs it, places it farther away, and manages not to set the curtain on fire. Small victories. Under the covers, the herbs continue to waft strange smells. You're not sure if it's making you sleepy or anxious, or both. Either way, you close your eyes and exhale. Outside, someone sings the first verse of a wedding ballad. It rhymes maiden with laden, and you stop listening after that. As the night stretches on, the bed remains a contested space between cultural expectation and personal awkwardness. You think about the many couples before you who lay under these same customs, who lay in beds much like this one, under the same flickering candlelight and the same curious eyes beyond the door, and who, just like you, probably whispered to themselves, "What in the name of Saint Apollonia is happening right now?" The hallway creaks with departing footsteps, but you know better than to believe you're alone. Downstairs, the wedding feast has not ended. It has merely shifted in tone. The merriment has taken on a sharper edge. More wine, louder laughter. Someone's probably attempting to juggle a roasted turnip while reciting a naughty limerick about miller's daughters. Because as far as the guests are concerned, your wedding night is no longer a private matter. It's gossip in progress. The bed smells of sage and goose down. You shift slightly and a feather escapes, drifting through the air like a lazy ghost. There's a clink as your husband accidentally elbows the bed frame. He whispers an apology to the furniture, then to you. You both sit in silence, listening to the collective hum of celebration beyond the door. And here comes the next absurdity. The gossip relay. Not officially a tradition, but deeply embedded in the culture of almost every medieval village. Somewhere between the boar's haunches and the pear pudding, someone will raise a brow and say, "Do you think they've done it yet?" The room goes quiet. Then the wagers begin. In noble courts, this curiosity was often more sinister, strategic even, because when a marriage had political stakes, the consummation wasn't just juicy news. It was a legally binding moment that could determine inheritance, land rights, and fragile peace treaties. Entire villages or entire duchies held their breath for that one fateful hour of awkward intimacy. You pull the blanket tighter around you. It's suddenly chilly, though the hearth is still glowing faintly. Your husband offers to throw on another log and immediately burns his thumb. He insists he's fine, though he now cradles the injured hand like a tragic bard. let's detour into one mainstream fact. Among the nobility in medieval France and England, it was common to designate official witnesses to the bedding. These weren't just nosy relatives, they were often clergy or court officials, sometimes tasked with escorting the newlyweds to bed, watching them climb in, and then remaining just long enough to confirm they were lying down together. That was the legal part. What happened afterward was assumed. There's even record of bed bonding ceremonies where the couple's wrists were tied together with ribbons or embroidered cloth symbolizing the binding of the union. Romantic in theory, deeply uncomfortable in practice. Back in your room, the candlelight dances across the stone walls. You've reached the point where both of you are pretending not to be exhausted. The day has been long, full of kneeling, nodding, reciting, feasting, being stared at, and attempting to look serene while someone explained in great detail how to boil a sheep's bladder for soup. That wasn't even part of the wedding. It just came up over breakfast. Your husband speaks again, this time to tell you a joke. It's about a knight, a monk, and a chicken. The punchline is weak, but you both laugh harder than it deserves. The tension cracks. You exhale for real. Then comes a knock. Not loud, not demanding, just insistent. 3 short taps. You freeze. He freezes. A pause. Then a woman's voice, low and professional. It is time. Time? Time for what exactly? The door opens a fraction and the shape of a middle-aged woman in a wimple leans in, holding a lamp and a sense of purpose. It's the inspector. You were warned, but part of you hoped it was just folklore. She steps in, closes the door behind her, and gives you a curt smile that somehow carries centuries of matronly authority. She carries a small cloth bag. You do not want to know what's in it. This is the morning inspection, except it's early. Sometimes, depending on custom, the inspection wasn't done at dawn. It was done now. The idea, confirm the marriage has been consummated, or at least provide some form of documentation that it occurred. Quirky tidbit incoming. In parts of medieval Spain and Italy, sheets were displayed outside the house. Yes, publicly, to prove the bride's purity and the legitimacy of the consummation. These honor linens were waved like flags. In some towns, drummers even paraded them through the street. Historians still argue whether these displays were voluntary, coerced, or completely fabricated with a bit of sheep's blood and flair for drama. In your case, the woman merely walks to the side of the bed, adjusts the covers slightly, and places a small white cloth, embroidered no less, between the pillows. She nods. For the morning. And with that she turns and glides out, shutting the door behind her. It clicks. Again. You stare at your husband. He stares at the ceiling. You both burst out laughing, quiet, exhausted, delirious laughter, the kind that comes from surviving something utterly ridiculous. He lies back, arms crossed behind his head, and says, "So, do you think they're still singing?" Outside, muffled through thick wood and thatched roof, comes a familiar refrain. Someone is absolutely still singing, possibly your uncle. And now the night inches on. The fire dwindles, the air cools. You listen to the distant clink of mugs, the flutter of tapestries shifting in the breeze, and the occasional burst of inappropriate laughter from the feast below. You are married. You have been paraded, blessed, feathered, inspected, and laughed into this new life. And though no one tells you this part, you're also allowed to just fall asleep. No scrolls decree that your love must begin with fireworks or choirs or even mutual comprehension. You can simply lie still, listen to your own heartbeat and breathe. Because when it's all stripped down beneath the symbolism, the rituals, the expectations, your wedding night in the Middle Ages is just 2 people. And a whole lot of bedding. You wake to the sound of snoring and the smell of onions. Not exactly the poetic beginning most songs promise, but then again, most medieval songs also include verses about flatulence and livestock romance. So your expectations are wisely calibrated. The hearth has gone cold. A single thread of smoke trails from the ashes. Pale morning light filters through the wooden shutters, drawing dusty stripes across the rumpled bed. Your arm is asleep. Your leg is tangled in linen. and beside you, your brand new husband is lying with his mouth open, gently whistling through a slightly crooked tooth. It is morning. Your wedding night, such as it was, is over. But the tradition, it isn't. Because now comes the next chapter in this delightfully invasive series of rituals, the linen check. You sit up slowly. Everything creaks, your back, the bed, the shutters. You shift the blanket and stare down at the delicately placed piece of cloth the inspector left between the pillows. It's still there, untouched, as white as a fresh snowfall and twice as stressful. You hear movement outside the door, a soft voice, then a tap. Are you decent? No, not emotionally, but you nod anyway. The door creaks open and the same middle-aged woman from the night before enters, flanked by your mother-in-law and one of the village elders. There's an air of ceremony, like a papal visit, only with more awkward eye contact. You resist the urge to make the bed. You're not supposed to. That would defeat the purpose. The woman walks forward, retrieves the cloth with a slight flourish, and examines it. There's a long pause. She says nothing. Your mother-in-law peers over her shoulder. The elder squints. The cloth is inconclusive. Let's talk historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in France, England, and the Balkans, it was customary to inspect the bridal linens for proof of consummation. This could be done by family members, midwives, or, in wealthier homes, a priest. If evidence was found, typically blood, it was celebrated. If not, well, things got complicated. Sometimes the cloth was presented publicly. Sometimes it was quietly noted and discussed in confidence. But either way, your first morning as a married person might begin with someone literally holding your laundry up to the light. Historians still argue over how common this practice really was. Some believe it was more symbolic than scientific. After all, not every bride would bleed, and not every groom would, successfully complete the mission. Others argue that in politically charged unions, the presence or absence of these signs could determine whether a marriage stood or was annulled. Back in your room, the inspector folds the cloth, tucks it back into her bag with a neutral hum, and gives a polite nod. Breakfast is ready. And just like that, you are released from judgment and cleared for mead and sausages. You dress, slowly, carefully. Every joint feels like it's been tightened by a medieval blacksmith. Your groom is upright now, rubbing his face and blinking at the sun like a mole dragged out of its burrow. He says, "Did that actually happen?" You say, "Yes." And then you both laugh. Again. Downstairs, the house smells of stewed apples, fried onions, and barley bread. The air is warm, crowded, and loud. Everyone is pretending not to stare at you. They absolutely are. There's a space at the head of the table where you're expected to sit, together, publicly, toasted like a pair of prized cattle at the market. As you approach, tankards are raised, voices lift in cheer, and someone shouts, "To the champions!" You do not feel like a champion. You feel like you survived a very strange initiation ritual involving feathers, whispers, and far too many people knowing far too much about your sleep schedule. The food is good, though. A roasted pheasant, a spiced carrot pie, a bowl of something gelatinous that everyone avoids except one uncle who claims it helps with digestion and other things. He winks. You look away. Halfway through the meal, a bard stands up and begins to strum a lute. He sings a ballad written approximately 5 minutes ago about your love, your marriage, and how the stars themselves blessed your bed with twinkling fertility. It rhymes heaven with bread leaven. Not his best work. Quirky tidbit time. In some regions, especially across parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, wedding night songs were commissioned in advance and performed the morning after, celebrating the couple's triumph. These songs ranged from sweet to scandalous. Some included very detailed metaphors involving ploughs, fields, and suspiciously enthusiastic garden references. They were considered good luck. Unless they were too accurate, then it became gossip ammunition for years. Someone hands you a goblet of sweet wine. You take a sip. Your groom clinks his against yours. Another cheer erupts. The bard hits a high note. The room spins ever so slightly with the warmth of it all. And then the questions begin. "So?" someone says with a grin. Was it everything you hoped for? Did the bed creak as much as ours did? Do you think she'll be with child before harvest? You smile politely. You answer vaguely. You consider hiding under the table, because in the Middle Ages your business was everyone's business. Marriage wasn't private, it was public theatre. And the wedding night? The climactic scene? Eventually the crowd turns its attention to dessert. You and your husband steal a quiet moment near the hearth, away from prying ears and toasting goblets. You sit close. Not because it's required, but because finally no one is watching, or pretending not to watch. The morning after may be more intrusive than the night itself, but in this moment it's just you, tired, hungry, married, and now possibly very slightly drunk. The crowd eventually thins like soup left on the hearth too long. People wander off, bloated with roast meats and mead, hiccuping through farewells and spilling half their goodbyes onto the flagstones. Someone tries to mount a horse and instead embraces it. Another insists on singing a third verse of the wedding ballad that absolutely did not need a third verse. And you? You finally exhale. The house is quieter now, still creaky, still draughty, still slightly herb-scented, but it's yours for the day. Or at least yours in the way that a borrowed carriage is yours until the horse keels over. The servants are bustling around like discreet shadows, trying not to make eye contact, but also definitely eavesdropping. The air is thick with leftover smoke, the scent of crushed flowers, and just a whiff of whatever someone spilled on the stairs during the toast. You make your way back upstairs to the bridal chamber. The bed looks exactly like it did earlier, unmade, dishevelled, and faintly accusatory. But now a single item has been placed on the windowsill, a dried apple with a tiny silver spoon stuck into it. Your groom points at it and says, "What's that?" You shrug. He shrugs. Neither of you touches it. That's probably for the best. Because now comes the question no one ever really explains. What if nothing happened? And let's say the wedding night was too overwhelming, or the wine hit too hard, or the bed just wasn't cooperating, or maybe one of you fell asleep mid-sentence. It's more common than the bards would have you believe. The thing is, in medieval Europe, consummation wasn't just tradition, it was legal. A marriage that wasn't consummated could be annulled, null and void, as if it never happened. And yes, there were actual procedures for that. Let's slip in a historical fact. In canon law, the Church distinguished between a marriage that was ratified, vows exchanged, and one that was consummated. Without consummation, a marriage could still be annulled for reasons like coercion, pre-contract with another person, or even physical inability to perform. Some annulments required witnesses, some required tests, and not the multiple-choice kind. Historians still argue how strictly these laws were enforced. In noble families, annulments were often political tools. If an alliance soured, someone might suddenly remember that the couple hadn't completed the marital duties. There are court records filled with dramatic claims and even more dramatic counterclaims. One duke apparently blamed a cursed walnut tart. Back in your chamber, your groom picks up a feather from the floor, turns it over and says, "Do you think we're legally married yet?" You reply, "Well, depends who's asking." It's a joke, of course, but there's a sliver of truth in it, because somewhere a priest is likely checking paperwork. Somewhere else, an aunt is whispering about annulment procedures involving hot irons and awkward testimony. And, somewhere far away, two families are already wondering if they should start planning for a grandchild or a scandal. And here comes a quirky tidbit. In some German principalities, if a couple failed to consummate the marriage, local officials could order what was essentially couples therapy via forced cohabitation. This was called a bed trial, and yes, it meant observers, sometimes officials, would monitor the couple over multiple nights to see if the issue resolved. If not, medical exams followed. You're welcome for that mental image. You lie back on the bed. The sun is bright now, leaking in through the shutters and drawing golden shapes across the crumpled sheets. Your husband stretches beside you, one foot dangling off the edge like a child trying to touch the floor without falling off. "You know," he says, "no one actually asked us what we wanted. You nod. Because in all the planning, all the rituals, all the bustling around and herbal arrangements and sheep-based metaphors, no one did. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't built on love. It was built on land, on cows, on political alliances and social order, and the hope that at least someone involved would produce a healthy heir with both ears in the right place. That's not to say love never happened, but it was a bonus. Like finding an extra plum in your barley stew. Nice, but hardly expected. So, what happens if the wedding night didn't go according to script? Well, probably nothing, at least not right away. You'd carry on, attend feasts, be seen, smile politely, pretend you're deeply fulfilled and not mentally replaying every moment from the night before, wondering if the priest could tell you both fell asleep before the candles burned out. Eventually, the whispers fade. A month passes, maybe 3. If no pregnancy appears, the questions return. But until then, you have the luxury of pretending everything is perfectly normal. You stand, stretch, and find a small bouquet placed near the hearth, parsley, rue, and something that might be dried beetroot, a gift from someone hopeful, or just another charm for fertility. Hard to say. The quiet is peaceful now. The servants are gone. The guests are gone. Even the bard has wandered off to write his next questionable rhyme. And for the first time in days, you are left alone with your thoughts, your new spouse, and the vast goose-feathered mystery of what comes next. The midday sun creeps along the floorboards like a lazy cat, warm and golden, wrapping the room in a hazy, gentle stillness. Outside you hear the distant clatter of hooves and a merchant hawking pickled beets, because of course pickled beets wait for no one, not even newlyweds. But here, inside your slightly smoky, slightly overstuffed chamber, time stretches, and you begin to wonder, what now? Because no one really tells you what happens the day after the day after. The wedding was the show, the feast, the night, the linen check, all high drama, rich in ritual, but now the rhythm of marriage begins, quietly, with little ceremony, and probably with laundry. You shuffle to the window and peek out. The village is already returning to its usual chaos. A dog chases a chicken, a woman yells at a boy for stealing apples. Somewhere, a lute is being played with more confidence than skill. The world didn't stop for your wedding. It just paused briefly to watch, and now it's moving on. Downstairs, your new in-laws are preparing for a visit from the notary. Why? Because it's time to talk contracts. Yes, you're married, but remember, marriage in the Middle Ages was also a transaction. And like all good transactions, it comes with follow-up documentation. Let's drop in a mainstream fact. In many medieval cultures, the wedding wasn't considered fully sealed until the dowry was formally transferred. This could include land, livestock, cloth, jewelry, or even a few prized beehives. The groom's family might owe a bride price or mourning gift in return, essentially a thank you note with gold trim. Speaking of which, the mourning gift is due today. You hear a knock. Not the nervous, breath-holding kind from last night. This one is solid, confident, transactional. A servant enters with a bundle wrapped in wool cloth. He sets it on the table and mumbles, "From the master." Then he bows and retreats, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. You unwrap the gift. Inside, a small silver brooch shaped like a tulip, a pair of soft leather gloves, and a folded scrap of parchment with your name written, albeit very awkwardly, by your new husband. The ink is smudged. One of the letters is backwards. It's both terrible and kind of charming. You smile. Here's your quirky tidbit. Mourning gifts were an expected part of post-wedding custom, especially in England and Scandinavia. They were symbolic offerings given by the husband to the wife the day after the wedding night, intended to acknowledge her new legal status and sometimes compensate for what she had given up. Gifts ranged from trinkets to entire estates. One 12th century noblewoman famously received a castle. You got gloves, still a win. You tuck the gloves into your chest and place the brooch on the windowsill, next to the mysterious dried apple. The spoon is gone now, no one knows why. The rest of the day unfolds in slow motion. You and your husband sit together in the courtyard. pretending to be invested in the conversation about fence repairs and grain prices. An old neighbour drops off a basket of wilted radishes as a blessing. A child offers you a frog. You accept both with equal politeness. Your husband tries to make small talk. "Do you like birds?" You reply. "Only the ones that don't attack me." He nods like that makes perfect sense. The awkwardness is fading, not because everything is suddenly perfect, but because shared silence is slowly becoming less terrifying. You begin to relax into the idea that you don't have to impress each other every minute of the day, that sometimes marriage just means watching the same chicken cross the same road 20 times in a row and wondering what its plan is. Historians still argue whether medieval couples, particularly arranged ones, actually developed affection. Some sources suggest many did. Eventually, there are letters and poems and wistful carvings on tree trunks that hint at tender love stories. Others show cold contracts and bitter disputes. It varied, like marriages always have. You glance at your husband. He's trying to shoo a bee away from his soup. It lands in his goblet. He looks betrayed. You rescue the bee. It's the first team effort of your marriage. It will not be the last. Later, as the sky bruises into evening, you return to the chamber. The bed is made. The herbs have been tidied, the candle stubs replaced. Someone even left a small cloth sachet on the pillow, lavender and mint, for sleep or dreams, or possibly warding off fleas. You lie beside each other again. No crowds, no songs. Just the hush of wind brushing against the shutter and the soft groan of wood settling around you like a sigh. And this time, when the covers are drawn up and the fire flickers low and your fingers brush in the middle of the bed, it feels real, not performative, not expected. Just two people sharing space. It's not love yet, but it could be. And that might be the most sacred part of the whole ritual, unwritten, unspoken, unseen. The next morning greets you not with a gentle sunrise or birdsong, but with the sharp clatter of wooden shoes on stone and a distant voice shouting about a missing goat. Welcome to married life, day 3. The glamour of the ceremony has fully worn off, like gilding flaking from a church icon after too many rainstorms. Your wedding garments are back in the chest. The celebratory garlands are wilting in the corners. The leftover pheasant has mysteriously vanished, possibly into the belly of a very smug kitchen boy. Today there's something else in the air, a kind of invisible tension. Not the awkwardness of a new union, no, this is something far more volatile. Family politics. You knew it was coming, you just hoped it might wait a week. Your husband is sitting stiffly in a carved oak chair, nodding solemnly as his uncle outlines what sounds suspiciously like a plan to renegotiate part of your dowry. Beside him, your mother-in-law is smiling the tight-lipped smile of a woman who has spent her entire adult life tolerating fools and expects you to do the same. You, meanwhile, are perched politely on the edge of a too-low stool, trying to look interested in a conversation that now involves pig weights, barley rights, and whether your father truly meant to include the eastern field in the marriage contract. This would be more manageable if you weren't also nursing a headache from last night's celebratory wine and exactly 3 hours of sleep. Let's pause for a mainstream fact. Dowry disputes were commonplace in the Middle Ages, particularly among landowning families. Marriage was not merely a union of two people, it was the collision of two sets of legal documents, expectations, and inheritance strategies. A miscounted goose could spark a feud that lasted generations. In some regions, a clause was even written into the wedding agreement specifying which party had to return which gifts if the marriage ended or remained childless. And guess what? People still found ways to argue about it. Now your husband's uncle is waving a rolled-up scroll in the air, claiming that there's ambiguity in the phrasing. Ambiguity? The document's in Latin and was written by a scribe who sneezed halfway through a critical clause. Of course it's ambiguous. You're suddenly aware that you too have power here. Your opinion, softly given, delicately worded, might carry weight. You're not just the bride. You're the bargaining chip turned stakeholder. Welcome to the family boardroom, where your embroidery skills are irrelevant but your father's sheep count is everything. You speak up, calmly. You clarify the field clause because you actually read the contract. A hush falls over the room. Even your husband blinks at you with a new kind of respect. The uncle deflates. The mother-in-law smiles, genuinely this time. Progress. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval Italian city-states, particularly Florence and Venice, women were expected to manage household finances and weigh in on property discussions once married. Dowries could make up half or more of a family's wealth, and wives were trained from girlhood to protect their own interests. One Florentine bride even successfully sued her in-laws for mismanaging her dowry, and won. That's the kind of energy you're channeling today. The conversation eventually turns to less fraught topics: harvest prospects, Cousin Benedict's ill-advised beard, and whether the new priest is secretly English. He is. His Latin has too many R's. You slip away mid-laugh, finding your way to the orchard behind the manor. The trees are heavy with early apples, sour and firm, the kind best for cider or hurling at geese. You breathe in the quiet. It smells of crushed grass, wood smoke, and possibility. Historians still argue whether medieval brides were passive participants in these affairs or quietly strategic players. Some chronicles describe them as pawns, others reveal letters, diaries, and court records where women manoeuvred skillfully, ensuring security for themselves and their children. The truth, as always, depends on the woman and the century, and how many loud uncles she had to outtalk before lunchtime. You sit beneath an apple tree. There's a soft breeze, insects buzz lazily. You hear someone calling your name from the kitchen window. Dinner, probably? You don't rush. Because today, something changed. You're still a bride, still figuring out this strange new partnership. But now you're also something else, a presence, a voice in the room, a name on the ledger, a person who remembers what the contract says and what it doesn't. You return to the house as the sun slips behind the rooftops, the fire's already lit, the stew bubbling. Your husband looks up when you enter. He offers you the larger spoon. It's not poetry, but it's a beginning. The days slip by like syrup over cracked bread, slow, sticky, and somehow uneven. You're no longer the newlywed with the wide eyes and stiff smile. You're just part of the household now. Your name gets shouted down staircases, added to chore rotations, and occasionally muttered during disputes over salted herring. In other words, you've arrived. But tonight, something's different. There's a smell drifting from the kitchen, rosemary, garlic, and the unmistakable sharpness of anticipation. Someone has laid out your formal tunic, the good one, the one without the mysterious gravy stain on the cuff. Candles have been placed in every windowsill, the hearth's been swept twice, and your husband is nervously combing his hair with a fork, which can only mean one thing: the bedding witnesses are coming again. Wait, you thought that was over? Oh, my dear medieval sleeper, think again. Because in some parts of Europe, particularly in rural France and northern England, a second bedding visit was customary, sometimes a few days after the wedding, sometimes even a week later. Why? To check in, to celebrate, to confirm the union was holding, or, if you're cynical, to sniff out early signs of scandal or pregnancy or lack thereof. Let's plant our mainstream historical fact here. The tradition of charivari, a rowdy, semi-mocking second ceremony, was practiced in multiple regions. Friends and neighbours would gather outside the couple's home, banging pots, singing bawdy songs, and demanding drinks or performances. Sometimes it was good-natured. Sometimes it was meant to shame couples into compliance with social norms. Either way, sleep was rarely part of the plan. So tonight, you brace yourself. The knock comes right on cue. A group of villagers stands at your door, smiling, tipsy, and extremely proud of the goat they've brought along as a joke. They sing loudly and off-key. The chorus involves your name, your spouse's name, and a long metaphor about baking bread that feels aggressively symbolic. You open the door, you smile, you offer ale and sweet buns. It is, after all, a performance. Inside, your home fills with bodies and stories and more candlelight than is strictly safe. You're asked, jokingly, how many heirs you plan to produce. Someone winks and says, "Hope you're not too tired tonight." Your cheeks hurt from smiling. Your eyes sting from the smoke. But you stay upright because you've learned the medieval art of gracious exhaustion. One older couple gifts you a carved spoon for stirring blessings. A child presents a rock shaped vaguely like a duck. Your husband quietly hides the duck rock in his boot. Let's insert our quirky tidbit. In some regions, like medieval Wales, it was common to place fertility charms under the couple's pillow during these follow-up visits. Carved wooden figures, pouches of seeds, or even dried frogs. Some were heartfelt, others were comedic. One preserved record mentions a prank involving a wooden fertility idol with far too many limbs. It was later blamed for triplets. Historians still debate whether these second visits were religious, civic, or just social mischief. Some suggest they evolved from pagan rituals, others argue they were sanctioned by the church to ensure moral accountability. Most agree they were, at the very least, inconvenient for introverts. Eventually, the guests trickle out, singing their final refrains and tossing handfuls of barley at your door for abundance. You suspect it's actually just to make the hens peck you awake at sunrise. The house goes quiet. You collapse onto the bed, fully clothed, barley in your shoes, laughter still echoing in your ribs. Your husband rolls onto his side and mumbles, "Do we get a third visit?" You whisper, "If they bring another goat, I'm moving into the root cellar." The candle burns low. The wind murmurs through the shutters like a nosy aunt. Somewhere, a spoon clinks in a forgotten mug. You're married, still. And somehow, despite the noise and the customs and the never-ending pageantry, you've begun to settle into the strange warmth of it all. This home, this bed, this version of you that survives goats and toasts and conversations about womb charms without blinking. You drift off to sleep with barley in your hair and a smile in your heart, knowing that while the wedding night is long past, the story of your marriage has only just begun. By the following week, the last remnants of your wedding have been swept out of the corners. The herbs tied to the rafters have dried into brittle whispers. The garlands once draped over doors are now nests for overly optimistic sparrows, and the leftover mead has been mysteriously consumed by your husband's cousins. Life has resumed its usual rhythms, feeding animals, dodging overly chatty neighbours, and trying to remember which side of the linen belongs on the inside. The village no longer points and whispers when you pass, at least not every time. You are settling in. Even the mattress has formed a dip that finally feels like yours. But before you get too cozy, there's another layer to peel back. The church has opinions. Yes, you were married in the eyes of your family. Yes, the bedding was witnessed, the dowry exchanged, and the spoonduck mysteriously relocated. But for many communities in the Middle Ages, the true authority on your union wasn't the in-laws, it was the church. And the church had rules, so many rules. This week, the local priest has summoned you both for a quiet marital reflection, a sort of post-game review. You go. Because you are, technically, God-fearing people. Also because the priest has a tendency to visit uninvited when ignored. You sit across from him in a small chamber that smells of candle wax and vague judgment. He adjusts his robes, clears his throat, and opens a heavy book, not the Bible, but another book, a marriage manual, because of course there were manuals. Let's drop a mainstream fact here. In the later Middle Ages, texts like the Decretum Gratiani and Summa Theologica outlined extremely detailed expectations about marital behavior, when, how, and even why couples should engage in certain acts. The church promoted intercourse solely for procreation. Pleasure was tolerated barely. Anything considered unnatural could be grounds for confession, or worse. You sit in stiff silence as the priest, face unreadable, offers a short homily about marital chastity, the sin of lust, and how St. Augustine once said, Even married couples should approach the bed with shame and trembling. You are not sure how to respond to this. Your husband nods. Slowly. Twice. You nod once, then regret it immediately. The priest continues, warning against wantonness, excessive fondness, and disorderly bedsheets, which sounds suspiciously personal. You begin to wonder if he spoke with your aunt. Eventually, the lecture ends. The priest blesses you both, offers you a dry biscuit, and recommends prayer before and after every conjugal act. You take the biscuit. You leave. Outside, your husband turns to you and says, "Do you think we sinned on the left side of the bed or the right?" You both laugh, too loudly. A passing nun gives you a look that could curdle cream. Let's pause for a quirky tidbit. In some monastic writings, especially in 13th century England, theologians debated whether specific days of the week were more sinful than others for married relations. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were usually off limits. Some even argued that relations during certain phases of the moon might displease God. Historians still argue whether regular villagers actually followed these guidelines or simply smiled and nodded while doing whatever felt right by candlelight. Back at home, the two of you re-enter your space with new awareness. Not shame, necessarily, but amusement. The idea that your bed now holds theological implications is both hilarious and vaguely terrifying. You inspect the mattress. It looks about the same. There's a new bundle of herbs on the windowsill, sage perhaps, possibly placed there by your mother-in-law, possibly placed there by the wind. You decide not to investigate. At dinner, you both avoid the topic. You talk about goats instead and roofing tiles, and whether the neighbour's child is cursed or just oddly sticky. But as the fire dims and the night hushes the house again, the weight of tradition settles in once more. You lie beside each other in the same bed, same sheets, same you, but now with a lingering awareness that somewhere, someone in a tower wrote a rule about your elbows. You curl toward the wall and whisper, Did you pray first? Your husband replies, "I blessed the pillow. It'll do." You fall asleep to the sound of wind rattling the shutters and the comforting creak of the bed frame. Now not just furniture, but a small rebellion. You wake to the sound of sheep arguing. Not actual words, obviously, but the kind of persistent, drawn-out bleating that clearly communicates dissatisfaction. Someone's late to let them out, and they have notes. You roll over, groaning slightly, and bump into your husband's elbow. He's already halfway through putting on a boot, backward. He mutters, "Morning, wife," with all the enthusiasm of a man who's just realized the latrine is frozen shut. Outside your window, life in the village is resuming its earthy, smelly, and occasionally confusing rhythm. And now that the wedding is old news, you're beginning to notice things, like how many people are suddenly watching you. The baker nods a little too knowingly when handing you bread. The washerwoman asks if you're feeling more womanly these days. The stable boy giggles every time you walk past, then pretends to inspect a rake. Even the priest greets you with a slightly raised eyebrow, as if your soul has become marginally more perilous overnight. Because here it is, people are wondering if you're pregnant yet, not because there's any sign, not because they have reason, just because it's been long enough for everyone's curiosity to ferment like leftover cabbage wine. It's the most ancient sport in medieval communities, speculative womb watching. Let's drop in a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, a newly married woman's primary expectation was to produce children, preferably male, ideally many, and definitely soon. Fertility was considered proof of a healthy, virtuous marriage. Infertility? That was another story. Accusations could fly, often aimed at the wife, though sometimes, quietly, at the husband. Remedies ranged from herbal tonics to pilgrimages to distant shrines, sometimes involving St. Anne, St. Margaret, or other well-connected heavenly intercessors. You spend the morning in the garden, pulling weeds and avoiding eye contact. The midwife strolls by and says nothing, but her smile says everything. Your husband, meanwhile, is dealing with his version of subtle pressure. His uncle has sent him a pamphlet. It's crudely illustrated. It is not helpful. At dinner, your mother-in-law casually places an extra cushion behind your back. You nearly choke on your stew. It's everywhere now, the gentle nudges, the meaningful glances, the sudden interest in your diet. Someone even offers you boiled leeks. For vitality, you thank them. You do not eat the leeks. Here comes a quirky tidbit. In parts of medieval Germany and Scandinavia, it was common to place carved fertility figures in the bedroom, little wooden statuettes of swaddled infants or embracing couples. These could be gifts or tokens left discreetly on your doorstep. You've now received 3. One is missing an arm. One winks. You bury them behind the house. Historians still argue whether these fertility pressures were constant across all classes. Among nobles, heirs were urgent, but among peasants, having too many mouths to feed could be its own curse. Some couples, facing hardship, may have delayed or even avoided children if they could. But contraception? That's a different chapter entirely. Tonight, as you prepare for bed, your husband holds up a dried root someone handed him earlier. Supposed to help, he says with a shrug. Help with what? You ask. He stares at the root. Everything? You both laugh, curling into the shared warmth of the blankets, finding that odd comfort again in being two people slightly overwhelmed by other people's expectations. The truth is, neither of you knows what you want yet. The idea of a child is abstract, heavy, not unwelcome, exactly, but certainly not something to be decided by the woman who stuffed nettles into your pockets at the market while chanting twins. And still in the quiet, you wonder, would you know? Would it feel different? Would the world tell you before your body did? The fire crackles low. Outside, the sheep have finally settled their argument. Inside, your thoughts drift gently toward nothing in particular. You fall asleep with a hand resting softly on your belly, not as an omen, just as a gesture, a maybe. And somewhere beneath the pressure and the pageantry and the peppered advice, a simple fact remains. You are still figuring it out. It begins with a cough, not yours, not your husband's. It's old Elsbeth, the woman who sells pickled things at the edge of town, who lets out a hacking wheeze, so violent it echoes across the square and rattles the poultry. You hear it as you pass the well, bucket in hand, and immediately someone whispers, "Plague." Then someone else whispers louder, "No, just bad onions." This is how rumours begin, but more importantly for you, this is how weddings and wedding nights get postponed, because suddenly your village is sick. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough that people begin wearing cloves of garlic on string necklaces. Enough that the priest is lighting incense with more fervour than usual. Enough that your mother-in-law insists on sprinkling vinegar over the windowsills and muttering about airborne miasmas. You're not frightened yet, but you are now officially under medieval quarantine, which is less like staying indoors with sourdough and more like pretending your house isn't full of drafty holes while someone seals your door with a blessed twig. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During disease outbreaks, particularly the plagues of the 14th century, newlyweds were often separated or confined. In some regions, marriages were postponed indefinitely. In others, they were hurried because of illness, in hopes of securing heirs before anyone dropped dead. Church officials advised couples to pray together rather than other things. You can imagine how well that went. You and your husband spend 3 days inside, sipping broth, arguing over who forgot to latch the shutters and avoiding any activity that might require a witness or a cloth inspection. The bedding witnesses are long gone. The pressure to produce a child, temporarily on hold. Instead, you rediscover something else, boredom. He teaches you a dice game that ends with you accusing him of sorcery. You teach him a sewing stitch that ends with him pricking himself and declaring a blood curse. You both attempt to fix a squeaky door and make it worse. He accidentally jams a ladle into the chimney and spends 2 hours apologizing to the soot spirit just in case. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some English villages during times of illness or famine, newlyweds were given protective charms called hearth tokens, small bits of iron or inscribed stones meant to safeguard the home. These were placed under beds or tucked behind door hinges. You now have 5. 2 came from your grandmother, 1 was left anonymously, 1 looks suspiciously like a potato. Historians still argue whether these charms were remnants of pagan customs or sanctioned folk Christian rituals. Some scholars say they were symbolic placeholders for action, something to do when no cure was available. Others think they were genuine spiritual defenses. Either way, your bedpost now has more accessories than your wardrobe. The house grows quieter as the days pass. The village goes still. The rooster crows with half-hearted commitment. The hens stop laying eggs, possibly in protest. You spend hours watching the fire, watching your husband try to repair a broken stool with a spoon, listening to the wind and wondering how long, till death do us part, really takes when the neighbor coughs that hard. And yet, oddly enough, the pressure lifts. No one is watching you anymore. No one is knocking. No one's asking if you feel fuller in the face or nudging you toward fertility herbs. The outside world is too busy clutching its throat and blessing itself. And in this strange, quiet lull, something gentle begins to form. You and your husband talk. Not about sheep, not about saints, but about what you actually remember from childhood. He tells you about the time he got lost during a hunt and spent the night in a tree with an owl. You tell him how you once faked an illness to avoid embroidery lessons and were rewarded with boiled onions for a week. It's nothing dramatic, just stories, just laughter, just quiet. You sit by the hearth, sipping tea made of who knows what, while he attempts to carve something that might be a duck, or possibly a horse, or possibly a very concerned loaf of bread. And for the first time since the wedding procession, you think, maybe this wasn't such a strange choice after all. Outside, the sickness begins to fade. The garlic necklaces disappear. The priest stops blessing the air with lavender smoke. Elsbeth returns to her stall, coughing less now, still selling those same unsettling jars of pickled mystery. And when someone finally knocks on your door again, it's not to ask if you're pregnant. It's just someone returning the ladle. With the village's brief apocalypse behind you and the scent of vinegar finally fading from the windowsills, normal life oozes back into the crevices of your days like damp through an old roof tile. You find yourself falling into rhythm, feeding chickens, skimming broth, arguing about firewood. It's not glamorous, but it's yours. And now, for reasons that no one really explains, you wake up next to a turnip doll. Yes, a turnip doll, not large, not menacing, just sitting peacefully on your bedside table with a tiny cloth cap and 2 mismatched button eyes. It stares at you with unblinking root wisdom. You poke it. It thuds softly. Your husband suggests it may have grown there. The mystery lasts until breakfast, when your mother-in-law breezes in with a basket of dried beans and casually mentions that she left a fertility charm by your bed. You freeze mid-chew. She smiles. It's blessed. You nod slowly and continue chewing, unsure whether that makes the turnip more powerful or just harder to throw away. Let's lock in a mainstream historical fact. Fertility charms were common across medieval Europe, and their forms ranged from the herbal, dried mugwort, rue and yarrow, to the symbolic, dolls, carved animals, and bundles of fabric dyed red. The red dye was important, linked to blood, life, and vitality. Women wore red ribbons, slept on red sheets, or kept red-stained cloths under their pillows in hopes of encouraging conception. Your turnip is not red, but it is wearing a red sash. Apparently, that counts. Over the next few days, more curious items appear. A pouch of rosemary under your pillow, a tiny broom hung above the bed, a clay coin tucked into your shoe. Your mother-in-law insists they're all just blessings. You suspect she's building a fertility shrine, one trinket at a time. Your husband finds a dried toadstool tied with string and asks, "Should we be worried?" You reply, "Only if it starts speaking Latin." He nods solemnly and places it respectfully in the drawer with the spoon duck. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Slavic traditions, women would sleep with specific objects beneath the bed to ensure fertility. Sometimes a bowl of milk, sometimes a sharp knife to cut away infertility, and occasionally a small live animal. Yes, live. One 15th century folktale features a bride sleeping beside a hedgehog for 3 nights as a test of patience and womb readiness. Historians remain divided over whether this was symbolic or just very weird. Meanwhile, your mother-in-law's efforts escalate. She insists on preparing your meals with the right spices, which now includes saffron, cinnamon, and something she refers to as moon pepper. She hands you tea that smells like a burned orchard and watches while you drink it. Your husband begins pretending to nap just to escape the suggestions. You don't mind. Mostly it's not unkind, just persistent. Everyone around you has decided that your womb is a communal project and that any hesitation is clearly due to bad energy or improper sock placement. You start hiding the charms, not all of them, just the noisy ones. There's one that jingles, that one had to go. Historians still argue over whether these folk rituals were genuinely believed or simply comforting customs. Some scholars think they offered women a sense of control in a time when so little about reproduction was understood. Others argue they were a way for communities to stay involved, perhaps too involved in each other's lives. Either way, turnip dolls were the least of your worries. One night, you and your husband lie in bed, surrounded by the various relics of your collective fertility: dried herbs, wax figures, scented sachets, and what you're pretty sure is just a clump of dirt with ambition. You look at him. He looks at you. You both burst into laughter. "This can't be normal," he says, wiping his eyes. "It's our normal now," you reply, adjusting the pillow so it doesn't crinkle from the hidden lavender packet underneath. You fall asleep like that, still giggling, still surrounded, still not quite sure how many of these things are magic and how many are just superstition with good marketing. And in the quiet of the night, with the window cracked and the scent of time drifting in, you find yourself grateful. Not for the dolls, not for the tea, but for the soft, ridiculous, turnip-scented intimacy that has somehow grown between you. You wake to a knock. Not a gentle one, not the polite little tap of a neighbor delivering eggs or a cousin returning a misplaced chicken. No, this one is firm, rhythmic, official. You sit up instantly, heart already rehearsing its sprint. Your husband groans beside you. Tell me it's not another goat. You pull on your tunic and crack the door open to find a midwife standing there. Not yours, not anyone's really. She's the village midwife, the one who's delivered more babies than you've had hot meals and speaks in riddles even when giving directions to the latrine. She gives you a long look, then gestures with a thumb over her shoulder. "We need to check the linens." You blink. "From last night?" She snorts. "From your first night, official business." It is not a request. Let's pause for your mainstream historical fact. In many regions of medieval Europe, especially among noble or landowning families, the inspection of marriage linens was a formalized ritual, sometimes conducted days or even weeks after the wedding. The aim? To confirm that the marriage had indeed been consummated. This was often crucial in cases where property or dowry agreements hinged on proof of physical union. A lack of evidence could open the door to annulment proceedings, family disputes, and more than a few awkward sermons. So now, days later, someone has decided that your linens still matter. You escort the midwife up the stairs where the bedding has long since been changed, fluffed, and lightly scented with suspicious herbs. She examines it anyway. She lifts a sheet to the light, frowns, sniffs once, why, and then nods. "Well enough," she declares. "Could have used a touch more ceremony." You resist the urge to explain that your ceremony was interrupted by a spilled candle and a screaming cat. Here's a quirky tidbit. In parts of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, midwives were sometimes called upon to examine stained cloths and offer interpretation, not just verification. Was the blood real? Was it enough? Did it come from the bride or somewhere else? In some regions, if there was no visible stain, brides were said to borrow linens from cousins who had proven more productive on their own wedding nights. It was a discreet barter system, One 14th century record mentions a woman being paid in cheese for a well-stained sheet. Historians still argue whether the stains were strategically enhanced. Your own inspection ends quickly. The midwife leaves you with a nod and a recommendation to eat more turnips. Makes the blood run better, she claims. You nod, even though you're deeply suspicious of turnips at this point. At breakfast, your husband stares at you over his porridge. They're still checking. You nod. He mutters, "Should we stage a scene? Get some beats?" You don't dignify that with an answer. The rest of the day unfolds with peculiar tension. You feel like you're walking around inside someone else's poem, one filled with metaphors about beds and roses and soil, none of which you asked for. The women in the market smile at you differently now. The butcher says, "Congratulations," then winks and hands you an extra sausage. By midday, a neighbour stops by to ask if she can see the linens. You tell her you've already buried them under a hawthorn tree, as tradition demands. She gasps. She's never heard of that tradition. You nod solemnly. Very ancient. Keeps the spirits content. She tells 3 people before the hour ends. Let's loop back to that scholarly debate. Some medieval legal historians argue that the obsession with linen inspection had little to do with morality and much more to do with property law. A consummated marriage couldn't easily be annulled, and that meant the dowry stayed put, the inheritance paths were secured, and the family could rest easy knowing no surprise annulment would pop up 5 years later when someone changed their mind. In other words, the stains were less about proof of love and more about not giving the goats back. That night, you and your husband sit by the fire, passing a piece of hard cheese back and forth. He's carving a spoon. You're pretending not to name the turnip doll. He says, "So, are we legally safe now?" You nod. The midwife nodded at our laundry. He considers that. Strange world. You both chew in silence for a bit. Then he adds, "I still say the beet idea had legs." You toss a pillow at him. And somewhere outside, under the hawthorn tree where you absolutely did not bury anything, the wind shifts. Leaves rustle. And the moon peers down with that sleepy indifference only the sky can manage, in a world where linen could decide your fate, where a doll could signal your worth, and where a midwife's eyebrow might carry the weight of a judge's gavel. Somehow you're still standing, and more importantly, still laughing. The next morning begins as all reasonable mornings should, with a rooster screaming directly into your window and a damp sock slapping you in the face. You sit up, dazed, blinking at the sock, which was flung, judging by trajectory and sheepish apology, from your husband's side of the room. He was trying to throw it into the laundry basket. He missed, spectacularly. You sigh, he grins, you throw the sock back at him. Marital bliss, but your brief peace is interrupted by a clatter downstairs and the unmistakable sound of the servants whispering far too loudly to actually qualify as whispering. You catch fragments. "She's bold, that one. Never seen a brow so high. And did you hear what she said about the porridge?" Someone new is in the house. You dress quickly and descend into the controlled chaos of the great hall to find her, a visitor, poised near the hearth, with perfect posture and an expression that says, "I do not get soot on my shoes." She's elegantly dressed, fine linen, delicate embroidery, and that unsettling stillness that only very wealthy people or cats possess. She's your husband's former, almost betrothed, and she's here for lunch. Welcome to noble politics. Let's anchor with a mainstream historical fact. In many medieval noble families, marriage arrangements were fluid, especially for younger heirs. Alliances were made, broken, remade, and sometimes reused. A woman once promised to one brother could, if negotiations shifted, be married off to another or even passed along to an uncle. And those previously unwed noble women? They often showed up later, at feasts, at festivals, sometimes at your table, still single, still powerful, and still entirely aware of what could have been. She greets you with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. You return the favour. Your husband tries to make awkward small talk about harvest yields. She redirects the conversation to poetry, court dancing, and her recent visit to a bishop who, she casually mentions, keeps peacocks. She has memorized 3 epic ballads and recites the opening lines of one without invitation. You, for your part, offer her more stew and less eye contact. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In certain regions, particularly Burgundy and parts of southern France, noblewomen trained for marriage were taught the art of subtle warfare, backhanded compliments, strategic embroidery, and tea made with herbs that subtly encouraged flatulence in rivals. One popular treatise on court behavior advised young wives to compliment the former beloved, while removing her shoes before firelight so that her stockings might betray where you are tempted, but you're also mature, mostly. The former almost bride remains composed, graceful, dreadfully confident. She compliments your hearth layout. She compliments your chair cushions. Then she compliments your linens, specifically their modest charm. Your husband coughs. You excuse yourself to the pantry before you commit a felony with a ladle. Historians still argue whether women in your position, married into a house where another match was once considered, were expected to form alliances or maintain cold distance. Some letters from the 14th century show warmth and camaraderie. Others include passive-aggressive notes about curtain colours and who got to sit closest to the fire. Let's just say parchment can hold grudges. When you return, the guest is preparing to leave. She thanks your husband for the meal, thanks you for your honest presence, and exits in a swirl of lavender and implications. Your husband turns to you, mouth open. You hold up a hand. Not one word. He nods. You spend the evening in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary and muttering things like modest charm and peacocks, honestly. Your husband offers to fetch you something stronger than tea. You accept. That night, as you both lie in bed, he says quietly, "I never wanted to marry her." You reply, I never almost married a bishop's niece." It's not exactly forgiveness, but it's close. Because in the end, the politics of marriage are rarely limited to 2 people. There are families, expectations, lingering ghosts in velvet slippers. But in the quiet between midnight and morning, all that remains is you, him, and the creaky bed that thankfully still has a turnip doll standing guard at the windowsill. And somehow, that's enough. The next morning, you wake up to silence. Not the comforting, sleepy kind. Not birds chirping or distant bells ringing or your husband snoring into his elbow. No. This is the kind of silence that feels loud, heavy, suspicious. You sit up. Then you smell it. Smoke. You race downstairs, heart pounding, nightshirt flapping, only to discover the oven. The oven is smoking. Not on fire, just expressing strong opinions about being overfed with dough and underappreciated. The kitchen girl stands frozen with a charred loaf in her hands and a look of utter betrayal on her face. You cough, wave the smoke away, and declare the bread officially very rustic. No one laughs, but the tension breaks. So begins a day not of disasters, but of small, frayed edges, a loose cartwheel, a spoiled sack of apples, a chicken that refuses to cooperate with the concept of fences. Your husband accidentally steps in something unpleasant and spends the rest of the morning limping with dignity. Your favourite mug breaks, it's all minor, but it's enough to wear you thin. Until midday, when your father arrives, unannounced, riding a horse that's too nice for the road, and bringing with him the air of someone who still believes he is the main character of your life. He greets you with a warm hug and immediately asks where your husband keeps the accounts ledger. Not because he wants to admire the penmanship, because he wants to check the numbers. Let's insert a mainstream historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly among merchant and noble classes, it wasn't uncommon for a bride's family to check in, sometimes obsessively, on how the dowry was being managed. Fathers, uncles, and older brothers might demand updates on investments, livestock health, or property expansion. A poorly managed dowry could damage a family's reputation or even be grounds for legal disputes. You make tea, you try not to clench your teeth. Your husband, bless him, handles it well. He answers your father's questions, shows him the ledger, even explains the unexpected expenses like the mysterious disappearance of 3 sacks of grain, which you later learn were bartered for lute strings and 2 suspiciously shiny hats. Your father listens, nods, frowns, and finally says, "She's got a good head, let her help with the books." Which is both a compliment and a command. Your husband agrees instantly, not because he's afraid, well, maybe a little, but because he knows you've been gently correcting his math in the margins for weeks. And just like that, you're officially in charge of the household accounts. Not the most romantic twist, but an oddly satisfying one. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In the late medieval period, women, especially those married into merchant or farming families, were often the true financial managers of the household. They tracked expenses, negotiated with suppliers, and even managed small business ventures. One 15th century Englishwoman kept such immaculate books that her husband's entire estate was settled without dispute after his death because of her ledgers. Historians still argue over how much economic power women truly wielded behind the scenes. In public, men often signed the contracts, but in private, women were the calculators, the budget balancers, the ones who remembered that 3 hens plus a broken plough did not equal a fair trade for a cow, no matter how charming the cow's owner. You spend the afternoon in the study reworking the numbers, sharpening the columns, and quietly adjusting the exaggerated tally of miscellaneous wine. Your husband brings you honeyed bread and murmurs, "Don't forget to include the cost of turnip dolls." You include them at 0 value, out of spite. Later that evening, as your father departs with a final warning to mind the barley margins, you exhale deeply, fully, like you've been holding your breath since the wedding feast and finally decided you're allowed to breathe now. And your husband? He just grins and says, "So, business partners now?" You shrug. "Don't get excited. I'm still charging interest." He raises a brow. "Romantic interest?" You throw the ledger at him. It's heavier than it looks. That night, as you lie in bed surrounded by balance sheets and leftover pastry, you feel something unexpected blooming in your chest. Not love. Not yet. But maybe something sturdier. Trust. The sense that between you and this strange, occasionally soot-covered man, you're building something that might actually last. And if not, at least you'll have excellent financial records when the annulment lawyers show up. The next morning, you awaken not to roosters, not to coughing midwives or ex-fiancés with peacock anecdotes, but to bells. Soft at first, then louder, clear, echoing across the rooftops. Church bells, celebration bells, the kind reserved for saints' days, royal births, and the extremely rare occasion when someone manages to find the mayor's missing dog. You sit up, groggy and half-tangled in last night's accounting parchment, and squint toward the window. The sky is grey, the bells are real, and down in the village square a crowd is already forming. You dress quickly, linen, wool, boots you can actually walk in, and head down with your husband trailing behind, still trying to figure out which way his tunic goes. It turns out the commotion is for a wedding, not yours, thankfully. That was weeks ago. This one is between a baker's daughter and the carpenter's youngest son, and the whole town is giddy with second-hand romance and very first-hand pastry samples. But as you watch the procession, floral garlands, neighbours cheering, someone's sheep accidentally joining the line, you feel a sudden tug in your chest, a strange ache, because you realise you don't remember your own wedding like this. Yours was louder, stiffer, heavier, full of ceremony, expectations, bed inspections, and blessed turnips. There was affection, yes, but also performance. This is joy in its simplest form. Young faces flushed with excitement. No land deals, no politics. Just flower-dusted fingers clutching each other like they're afraid to let go. Let's pause here for a mainstream historical fact. In smaller villages and among peasant classes, weddings were often community-centred but relatively informal affairs. While noble weddings involved contracts, priests, and witness testimony, many rural unions were sealed with a simple vow, a cup of ale, and a shared loaf of bread. Church involvement came later, sometimes weeks afterward, and in some places simply cohabiting and calling each other husband and wife was enough to be considered married under common law. Your husband leans toward you and mutters, "Should we crash the feast?" You glance at the direction of the kitchen tables being set up. "How much bread do you think we'd need to bring?" The two of you do not crash the feast, not entirely, but you stay for the blessings, the music, and the celebratory dance that nearly takes out 3 chairs and 1 elderly goose. You clap, you laugh, you remember. And here comes your quirky tidbit. In some medieval French villages, guests at a wedding feast would bring symbolic food items, not just gifts. Bread was common. So were eggs, honey, and even wine jugs with tiny riddles tied to the handle. One tradition involved giving the couple a marriage cheese, which they were supposed to eat only after their first argument. Sometimes it went uneaten for years, sometimes hours. As the sun begins to set, you and your husband walk back home with fingers lightly intertwined. No crowds, no garlands, no ceremonial barley being hurled at your heads. Just 2 people. At home, the fire's already crackling. The hearth smells of roasted onions and thyme. A leftover turnip doll has been mysteriously repositioned on the mantel, arms outstretched like it's conducting an invisible orchestra. You settle into your favorite creaky chair. He brings you warm cider, and you both sit quietly. The only sound, the gentle pop of logs and the occasional pigeon having a nervous breakdown on the roof. "Would you do it again?" he asks softly. You raise an eyebrow. "Marry you?" He shrugs. Well, yes, eventually. But I meant the whole thing. The procession, the feasts, the bed inspections, the bells, all of it. You think for a moment. "I'd skip the boiled leek blessings," you say. He chuckles. "But yes, I think I would. Maybe slower, maybe with fewer witnesses, but yes." He nods, satisfied. You lean your head on his shoulder. The turnip doll falls over. No one bothers to fix it. Historians still argue over whether love was a central part of marriage in the Middle Ages, or just a bonus if you got lucky. The truth lies somewhere in the soft space between ritual and reality, between duty and kindness, between accounting ledgers and the touch of a hand after a long day of dodging geese and relatives. And in that moment, curled up by the hearth, cider warming your fingertips, you realize something. You may have married under the gaze of 50 relatives and 1 very judgmental priest. But love? Love snuck in through the back door, probably tripped over the broom, and stayed anyway. There's a knock at the door again. You groan loudly. It's the 3rd knock this week. You've begun to associate that sound not with visitors, but with assignments, because apparently being married means becoming the village's unofficial emotional archive, postal service, an emergency arbitrator. Your husband peers out the window. It's your cousin. You sigh. Which one? The one with the 3 goats and the dramatic wife. Ah, that narrows it down to exactly 1. You open the door to find Cousin Gerwin standing there with a face like someone spoiled the cream and blamed it on him. He removes his cap, clutches it like it contains all his remaining dignity, and says, "I need help." Of course he does. So begins a new chapter of medieval matrimony that no one really warns you about, being the stable couple. After only a few weeks of surviving turnip dolls, bed inspections, linen politics, and family dowry disputes, you've inexplicably become go-to advisors on love and marriage. Why? Because you haven't murdered each other. Apparently that's a benchmark. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. In many medieval communities, older or more successfully paired couples were often approached for informal marital advice. These roles weren't official, but they carried weight, especially in small villages where priests were too busy cataloguing relics or scolding children for dancing on Sundays. Advice ranged from the practical, keep a separate chamber pot, to the spiritual, pray to St. Gengulphus for patience, to the extremely herbal, boil yarrow under a full moon and inhale respectfully. Cousin Gerwin sits at your table with his head in his hands and confesses that his wife, Marta, refuses to speak to him after he traded her favorite blanket for an underwhelming piglet. You nod solemnly. Your husband hides a smirk in his cider. you offer the most time-honored piece of medieval marital advice you can muster. Buy the blanket back, apologize with bread. It's shockingly effective. He leaves with hope in his step and a small loaf tucked under his arm. That same week, 3 other villagers stop by. One wants to know how to tell if her new husband is cursed. Another asks if she should sleep with her feet facing north or south for maximum fertility. A third simply cries into your apron for 10 minutes while your husband hands her a spoon like it might help. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of medieval Germany and Bohemia, there were actual marriage benches placed in town centres where couples could sit publicly and talk through disputes. These benches were sometimes overseen by a village elder, and if a resolution wasn't reached by sunset, the couple could be fined. One village even painted a bench red to discourage unnecessary visits. It did not work. You begin to wonder if you should start charging for these sessions, or at least offer a loyalty program. Buy 4 bundles of unsolicited advice, get a bonus turnip charm. But even as the requests pile up, something unexpected happens. You and your husband start to feel unified. Not just cohabitating, not just sharing blankets and stale honey cakes, but teaming up. Your eyes meet across the room when someone asks if their cow is a bad omen. Your nods sink. Your eyebrows rise in tandem. You've become an us. Historians still argue whether medieval couples experienced the kind of emotional intimacy modern partnerships strive for. Most surviving records focus on economics, lineage, land. But hidden in letters, wills, and a few cheeky love poems are hints, notes about shared glances, inside jokes, and long walks to the edge of the field and back. Real affection, real companionship. You sit by the fire that night, rubbing your temple after advising a newlywed that no, his wife is probably not a selkie in disguise. Your husband returns from the pantry with a half-squished plum and says, "What if we pretended to be bad at marriage? Maybe they'd stop coming." You raise an eyebrow. "You want to fake an argument in public?" He grins. "I'll storm off." You throw a turnip. Tempting, but instead you lean into the warmth, let the fire crackle, and accept that, accidentally or not, you've become a model. Not a perfect one, but a quietly functional one. The kind that doesn't need ballads or banners or ceremonial inspections to prove it's working. Just 2 people, a ledger, a few roasted leeks, and a deep, mutual understanding that all marriages, medieval or otherwise, are mostly just long conversations punctuated by chores and interrupted by goats. You're elbow deep in cabbage when the letter arrives. It's sealed with wax, pressed with a crest you don't recognize, and carried by a messenger who refuses to make eye contact with anyone taller than a chicken. You wipe your hands, squint at the seal, and immediately regret doing so. It's from your husband's great-aunt, the famous one. The one who once hosted a wedding with live swans inside the banquet hall and hasn't been seen since the garlic soup incident of 28. She's coming to visit. In 3 days, with her entire entourage, you drop the cabbage. Your husband reads the letter twice, then stares at the wall like it personally betrayed him. This is no ordinary guest. This is a woman who once refused to sit on a wooden chair because it looked too judgmental. A woman who critiques soup temperature with the precision of a royal tax assessor. A woman who, legend says, once arranged her own bedding ceremony for herself after a particularly satisfying dinner. You have 3 days to turn your moderately clean, barley-scented, goose-friendly household into something resembling high court hospitality. Let's insert a mainstream historical fact. Wealthy noble visitors in medieval times could arrive with entire mini-courts, servants, guards, horses, even travelling minstrels. Hosting them wasn't just about comfort, it was a test of rank, reputation, and the proper storage of multiple cheeses. A poorly handled visit could damage your social standing, your alliances, and your future invitations to important things like feasts, jousts, and talking circles, where everyone drinks mulled wine and complains about feudalism. The house erupts into motion. Beds are restuffed, curtains are beaten clean. The turnip doll is temporarily relocated to the attic for being too peasant adjacent. Your husband tries to polish a wooden beam with a goose feather. You gently remove the feather and hand him a cloth. And then, to make things interesting, your mother-in-law decides this is the perfect time to stage a public comparison of marriage quality between your union and hers. She invites 3 neighbors for tea. One of them brings a pie. Another brings a copy of your wedding contract. There are charts, there are linen samples, there is an informal scorecard. "Mine never forgot to salt the stew," she says. "Well, mine never tried to baptize the cat," you reply. The guests nod approvingly. The mother-in-law looks like she just lost a joust. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval Italian towns, particularly Florence and Siena, marriage comparisons were not only common, they were formalized in dowry registers. These documents recorded not only assets but also household harmony, respect between spouses, and in one case, ability to host without visible panic. Some brides wrote updates years later, noting their husband's improved behavior during storms. Your home, though small and mildly smoky, begins to transform. The good linens come out. Someone mysteriously delivers a bowl of apples shaped like saints. You find yourself rehearsing responses to compliments you haven't received yet. On the morning of the visit, you wake before dawn, nerves humming. You bathe, you dress, you bribe the chickens to behave. And then she arrives, a tall woman in crimson velvet, flanked by 2 attendants, a travelling musician, and what appears to be a personal tapestry roller. She enters like a bishop entering a chess game. She surveys the room, nods once, then says, "Where is the hearth? I want to test your embers." You lead her to the fireplace. She stares at it. She taps the stone. She nods again. "Stable marriage," she murmurs. "Good ash pattern." You do not laugh, you do not blink. You simply accept this as a compliment. Over lunch, she quizzes your husband on crop yield, you on linen folding symmetry, and both of you on the philosophical implications of shared bedding in spiritually ambiguous seasons. You do your best. He tells a story about a goose falling into the stew pot that makes her laugh. She gives him a coin. You're still not sure if it was a reward or hush money. Historians still argue over the purpose of these noble inspection visits. Some claim they were for matchmaking. Others say they were informal audits of loyalty and protocol. A few believe they were just excuses for wealthy widows to show off and eat pie somewhere new. As the day winds down, your guest stands, places her gloves carefully back into their embroidered pouch, and says, "The marriage is strong." The cabbage was passable, the duck was suspicious. Then she leaves. Your husband collapses into a chair. You remove the saint-shaped apples from the windowsill. The mother-in-law mumbles something about her stew never being described as passable, and disappears for the rest of the evening. You sit together in the quiet aftermath, too tired to speak, too proud to sleep. You've passed the test. Maybe not with honours, but with dignity, and possibly a blessing from the velvet aunt who left a bundle of sage and a note that simply reads, "For further fortification." You don't know if she means your marriage or your stew. Either way, you take it. The next day, the household is strangely quiet. No dramatic guests, no midwife inspections, no neighbours asking if your fireplace feels spiritually aligned. Just you, your husband, the faint smell of boiled cabbage lingering in the rafters, and the feeling that somehow you've entered a new phase, a more watched phase, because today, without warning, a nun appears, not in a puff of incense or a swirl of divine fabric, but calmly at your door, holding a parchment and a basket of eggs. She introduces herself as Sister Agatha. She does not blink. She hands you the eggs, and she informs you that she has been assigned to begin your conception calendar. You almost drop the eggs. Let's plant a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, especially in more devout regions and among the landed classes, conception was not left entirely to chance, or even romance. The church often encouraged couples to follow so-called marital calendars that advised when a child should be conceived based on holy days, feast seasons, and even lunar phases. Some believed certain days would result in stronger boys or more obedient girls. Others warned against conceiving during Lent unless you wanted to give birth to a heretic. Sister Agatha lays out the scroll like a general mapping a siege. It's covered in scribbles, moon cycles, feast day markings, saint initials, and one truly mysterious doodle that looks like a goat wrestling a fish. She points to a date next week. "Favourable," she says. Your husband, looking very much like a man facing an agricultural tax audit, mutters, "And if it rains?" Sister Agatha does not answer. She simply taps the date again, hands you a holy medallion of St. Margaret, and says, "Drink fennel tea, avoid onions." She vanishes shortly after, leaving you both staring at the parchment, the medallion, and the eggs, which are, to be fair, very fresh. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In some 14th century German convents, nuns were unofficial fertility advisors. With no children of their own, they were considered unbiased. Some were midwives, others were trained in what passed for natural philosophy, herbs, astronomy, even dream interpretation. A few carried notebooks full of predictions based on the sound of a sneeze or the direction a dog barked during a storm. Historians still debate whether these calendars were more folklore than science. Some argue they were a way to provide structure in a chaotic world. Others see them as attempts to insert control over something no one could truly predict. You try to play along. That night, you dutifully brew the fennel tea. It tastes like a garden giving up. You light the blessed candle and sleep facing east. You wear the medallion. You avoid onions, mostly. Your husband offers to chant a psalm. You ask him to just brush his teeth. The week passes with increasing awkwardness. Everyone seems to know. The baker starts slipping you vitality loaves. The priest stops making eye contact. Even the cows seem judgmental. On the favourable day, you both go about your normal chores while trying not to make it weird. It is extremely weird. You accidentally spill flour on the calendar and spend 10 minutes trying to clean it without smudging St. Gregory. Your husband spends most of the day fixing the fence, badly. When night falls, the pressure feels like a third person in the room. You look at him. He looks at you. The medallion glints in the candlelight like a silent chaperone. Finally, he says, "Want to just talk instead?" You nod, gratefully. And so you do. You talk. About the bakery, about the neighbour's rooster that crows at midnight, about the bizarre possibility of goatfish hybrids and whether that doodle on the calendar was prophetic or just bored artistry. You fall asleep that night wrapped in nothing but wool and words. Historians often forget these nights, the ones not filled with battles or births or proclamations, the ones where nothing happens. But it's in these quiet, expectation-heavy, oddly sage-scented nights that something more durable begins to form. Not the thrill of passion, not the panic of ceremony, but the soft, steady accumulation of comfort. You might conceive nothing tonight, or everything. You wake to birdsong, real birdsong, not chicken squawking, not a rooster screaming his way through puberty, but actual melodic, almost suspiciously pleasant birdsong. You blink. The bed is warm, the room is still. The turnip doll is resting peacefully on its side, its red sash faded now to a dignified pink. No one's knocking, no one is checking linens, dates, or whether you've eaten your daily beet. You stretch, you smile. And then you remember, today is market day. Not just any market day, the first market day since your wedding, which means you're not just shopping, you're parading. Your marriage is on display, whether you like it or not. Every onion you buy will be analysed, every glance exchanged will be overinterpreted, and someone, probably the blacksmith's wife, will absolutely ask if your moon cycle has ripened. Loudly. You brace yourself. Let's insert a mainstream historical fact. In medieval towns and villages, market days were more than just a chance to buy turnips and questionably fresh fish. They were social hubs, places where news was exchanged, alliances whispered, gossip fermented, and young couples were evaluated. Married pairs were watched for signs of harmony or discord. Was the husband carrying the basket? Did the wife smile too much at the miller's apprentice? These details mattered. You and your husband head out together, basket in hand, coins counted, smiles armed. The path to the market is lined with stalls, spices, cloth, dried herbs tied in nervous little bundles. The air smells of yeast, damp wool, and just a whiff of regret from the fishmonger's bucket. You pass a group of older women who stop mid-conversation to nod approvingly. One whispers, "Still married," as if you're a limited edition cheese that hasn't spoiled. The baker offers you a discount on your usual loaf and slides you a bun with cinnamon for fertility. You do not ask what he put in the glaze. Someone hands your husband a turnip for strength. You buy apples, barley, and a pair of second-hand wool socks that your husband insists are for formal occasions. You know he's just going to wear them to nap, and then, as expected, the questioning begins. So, how is the married life? Have you started trying? Does he snore? Have you seen the fertility goat this month? She's walking sideways again. You answer politely, vaguely, with practiced expressions of mystery and faint amusement. It's a game after all, this polite theatre of innuendo and oversharing. You say just enough to feed the whispers, not enough to trap yourself in a prophecy. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of 13th century Provence and Flanders, there were actual fairs where newlyweds were expected to walk side by side in public and answer scripted questions about their courtship and wedding night. Some communities even awarded tiny wooden medallions for good answers, which were worn like badges of honor, or, depending on your attitude, as ironic jewelry. Historians still argue whether this kind of public performance helped strengthen marriages or just increased passive-aggressive baking competitions. Either way, people remembered who answered well. As you and your husband make your way back home, baskets full, cheeks flushed, cinnamon bun half-eaten between you, he says, "So, how'd we do?" You consider. "No one threw a cabbage." He grins. That's a win." You spend the afternoon quietly. He patches a section of fence that no one asked him to patch. You grind herbs for stew. The house smells of garlic, thyme, and faint ambition. The turnip doll watches, solemn as ever. Later, as the sun dips and the fire is coaxed into life, your husband takes your hand and kisses your knuckles, gently, almost absent-mindedly. Not for show, not for someone else's story, just because. And it occurs to you, while the world continues to spin its stories around your union, while villagers whisper and nuns chart cycles and cousins ask suspicious questions about sheep dreams, you are building something smaller, quieter, realer, not for the market, not for the church, for you. It begins with a whisper. Not the scandalous kind, not the "did you hear what the miller's son did with the tavern goat?" kind. No, this is quieter, more reverent. You overhear it at the well, two older women hunched over a pail, one nodding sagely, the other clutching a rosary like it's a talisman against gossip. They say she's been praying to St. Margaret, one says, every night. You lean in, because the she is you. You haven't? Well, once. Maybe. But it was more of a muttered, half-hearted plea while trying to find your other shoe in the dark. Still, the rumor has begun. You, dear listener, are now known as the wife who prays for a child. Whether you do or don't, let's anchor this with a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, St. Margaret of Antioch was widely venerated as a protector of childbirth and pregnancy. Women trying to conceive often visited shrines in her name, carried relics, or recited special prayers while holding blessed candles. In some areas, her name was etched into charms worn over the heart or stitched into undergarments. Her cult was so popular that some birthing rooms kept statues of her in the rafters to watch over the delivery. You do none of this. But that doesn't stop the gifts. A small bundle of herbs arrives at your door, yarrow, mugwort, and something that smells faintly of damp sop. No note. Later, someone leaves a wooden figurine carved in the shape of a chubby baby holding wheat. Again, no note. But it is sitting directly on the doorstep, facing the door like it's ready to file a complaint. Your husband raises an eyebrow. Is it watching us? You nod. Yes, and I think it's judging our housekeeping. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of rural Poland and Bohemia, it was customary for neighbors to anonymously gift fertility tokens to new brides, especially if conception was taking longer than the community preferred. These included carved spoons, herbal bundles, small dolls, or bread loaves with womb-friendly inscriptions. Some families even held encouragement feasts, where all the food was round and suspiciously symbolic. No one admitted why, everyone knew. You begin finding these offerings tucked into the oddest places, inside your pillowcase, hanging from the clothesline, balanced on top of your husband's boots. At one point, you open a cupboard and 3 dried apples roll out, each with a tiny cross etched into the skin. You keep them, not because you believe, but because throwing them away feels like breaking a promise you never made. Historians still debate whether this public attention to a couple's reproductive status was helpful encouragement or oppressive interference. Some say it gave women community support in an otherwise isolating experience. Others argue it simply transferred the burden of private pain into public spectacle. You begin lighting a candle at night, just one. Not because you expect anything, but because it gives the room a glow you've come to find oddly soothing. A soft, flickering warmth against the dark corners of too many questions. One night, your husband notices. "Saint Margaret?" he asks, nodding toward the flame. You shrug. Maybe, or maybe I just like the quiet. He doesn't press, he just sits beside you, resting his hand gently over yours, and for a while you both just breathe in the stillness. No nuns, no cousins, no turnip dolls, just the sound of wood crackling and the way the shadows dance without asking permission. Eventually you say, "If it happens, it happens." He nods. "And if it doesn't," you smile, "then we'll still have good soup." That's not nothing. And as you drift to sleep that night, the single candle flickers once, then fades, leaving behind the faint scent of beeswax and something else, something softer. Hope, maybe, or just peace. You dream of onions, metaphorically. Just onions, piles of them, endless rows stretching across an open field, while a turnip doll judges you from atop a distant barrel. You wake up vaguely disturbed and very hungry. Outside it's raining, one of those steady, grey, unbothered rains that seeps into the bones of everything. Roofs, sheep, marriages. You wrap yourself in a shawl and make your way to the hearth. Your husband is already up, poking the fire with the same intensity one might reserve for a small duel. He looks over. "It's soup weather." You nod. "Everything weather." And so begins the quietest kind of day, a marriage day. Not a ceremony, not a feast, not a favourable conception alignment, thank the saints. Just one of those middle days in a middle life where the routine folds around you like worn fabric. You stir the pot. He checks the roof. A shingle slips. He curses creatively. You make note of it for later storytelling. Let's take a moment for a mainstream historical fact. Most of medieval married life was not about pageantry or politics. It was routine, chores, meals, managing livestock. In peasant households especially, the couple worked side by side, ploughing, planting, grinding, baking, repairing. There were no romantic poems written about these tasks, but they built the foundation of a household far more than wedding linens ever did. You and your husband spend the morning mending things, a broken bench, a frayed cloak, a slightly unstable shelf that's been threatening to flatten the spice jars for weeks. He lifts, you hold. You argue over angles, then laugh when it still leans like a drunken monk. Around midday, the priest arrives, soaked, shivering, and holding a parcel. "A delivery," he says between sneezes. "From your husband's aunt, again." You invite him in, hand him a towel, and eye the parcel suspiciously. It's wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a ribbon. Inside you find a handkerchief embroidered with fertility symbols and a very detailed recipe for birthing broth. You hand the cloth to your husband without comment. He places it on the shelf next to the Saint Margaret medallion, the goat-shaped candle, and the increasingly dusty conception calendar. The collection is becoming a museum. You consider charging admission. Here's a quirky tidbit. In certain Swiss villages, there was a tradition of gifting newlyweds a hope shelf in the kitchen, a space specifically meant to hold charms, herbs, or tokens associated with future children. If the shelf remained empty too long, neighbours sometimes began to contribute uninvited. It was both a blessing and a passive-aggressive hint, wrapped in carved wood and dried flowers. The priest dries off by the fire and casually reminds you of the upcoming St. Genesius feast, during which couples are encouraged to renew their vows. Publicly, you ask? He nods. Preferably with music. Your husband mouths no from behind the priest's shoulder. You cough to hide a laugh. After he leaves, you sit by the fire and finally, properly exhale. Because no matter how quiet the day, there's always some new pressure waiting in the wings, another expectation dressed in ribbons and ritual. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages grew stronger with time or simply more tolerable. Some suggest affection deepened through shared hardship. Others point to letters filled with complaints about snoring, stew temperature, and the inexplicable disappearance of left shoes. Marriage, they say, was never the goal. It was the beginning of a much more complicated kind of endurance. You think they're probably right, because here you are, soaking lentils in a crooked kitchen, listening to rain drum on the roof, your husband humming off-key, and your future currently represented by a shelf full of symbolic clutter. And yet you feel content, not euphoric, not swooning, just safe. Later you eat soup together at the long table, no guests, no witnesses, no ceremonial garlands, just the two of you, passing bread back and forth, occasionally kicking each other under the table like school children who secretly like one another. And as the fire burns low, the wind sighs against the shutters, and the turnip doll continues its silent watch from the windowsill. You think, if this is what marriage becomes, quiet, cluttered, and soup-filled, I can live with that. The first frost comes early. You wake to a window pane traced with delicate white lacework, a breath of cold already seeping in through the shutter cracks, and your husband curled up like a hibernating hedgehog under half the blanket. You reclaim your half with practiced tugging. He groans and mutters something about traitorous toes. Outside, the world is shimmering and still. Every leaf rimmed in silver, every blade of grass bowed low beneath the weight of the morning chill. The village is quiet, save for the occasional crunch of someone braving the path in wooden clogs and the distant squawk of a chicken who did not agree to winter. The hearth crackles to life. You cradle your cup of cider, watching your breath puff out in little clouds. Your husband joins you wearing two mismatched socks and an expression that says he's already over the concept of seasons. Today is for preparation. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. For medieval households, the first frost marked the beginning of the true wintering period, when preservation became everything. Vegetables were pickled, meats salted or smoked, herbs dried, and root cellars packed like paranoid treasure troves. It was a time of planning, rationing, and praying the rats didn't develop tool use. You and your husband take stock of your pantry. There are onions, so many onions, enough to build a small fortress. Barley, dried beans, a concerning number of turnips, several carved, and 2 wheels of cheese that squeak when you poke them. You choose not to ask why. The cellar has enough to get through winter, assuming no surprise feasts, no surprise guests, and no surprise mice who've unionized. Your husband counts the firewood, then counts again, then stares into the middle distance as though trying to will trees into existence. You agree to chop more, and so begins a day of chopping, stacking, bundling, and chasing rogue logs that roll downhill with a worrying sense of purpose. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In some medieval German households, there was a superstition that newlyweds who prepared their winter firewood together would have a strong first child, but only if they split exactly 50 logs without bickering. If they argued on the 49th, the child would be spirited if they argued on the first. The child would have 2 cowlicks and a tendency to steal geese. You reach log 43 before an argument breaks out over the correct angle of an axe swing. You both pause, stare at each other, then laugh. Loudly, you declare the future child officially spirited. That evening, tired and dusted in wood chips, you collapse together by the hearth, soup warming in the pot, your fingers brushing as you pass the bread. Historians still argue over whether the act of doing hard things together, especially repetitive, seasonal labor, was what actually created emotional intimacy in medieval marriages. Romantic letters were rare, shared calendars even rarer. But splitting firewood, hauling barrels, and surviving long winters? That created understanding, and maybe even affection. You look over at your husband, face lit orange by the fire, hair stuck up like a startled goat's, and think, this is not what they sing about in ballads. And yet it feels honest. You're not preparing for war or pilgrimage or scandal. You're preparing to stay. You hang bunches of thyme and sage by the window to dry. He wraps the shutters tighter. You find an old blanket in the trunk that still smells faintly of summer grass. Together, you ready the house for the long hush ahead. The turnip doll is given a new place, on a little shelf above the hearth, tucked beside a candlestick and a spoon that may or may not be decorative. You light the candle beneath it, just for the warmth. And as the snow begins to drift in gentle flurries outside, you wrap yourself in wool, tuck your feet beneath his, and listen to the world go still. This isn't a wedding night, it isn't a feast, but it is something better. A home. You measure time now in firewood and soup. The days have shortened, curling in around the edges like damp parchment on a hearthstone. Mornings come late and cold, and nights arrive early, thick with frost, heavy with stillness. The village hibernates, the gossip quiets, even the hens seem to whisper. Your routine becomes sacred, not dramatic, not worthy of a ballad, but sacred all the same. Wake. Stoke the fire, warm the bread, watch your breath float in the morning light before the shutters are fully drawn. Wrap yourself in layers, one for warmth, one for protection, one, maybe, for the weight of expectation that still clings like cold mist. Your husband now has a routine of his own. He clears the path, refills the kindling box, and mutters philosophical questions like, is it soup if it contains no ingredients? The answer is no, it's disappointment in a bowl. But today, the rhythm is interrupted. A messenger arrives. He's young, barefoot, nose red with cold. He brings a letter with no seal, just your name, scrawled in ink, that's already begun to smudge. You read it once, then twice, then sit down, because it's from your cousin Lena, your favourite cousin, the one who eloped with a travelling tanner last spring, the one who was, as the village whispered, too bold, too bright, too much. She's pregnant. She's inviting you to visit before the child comes, before the snow gets too deep, before the midwife starts boiling herbs no one should ever name aloud. You don't hesitate. Let's place a mainstream historical fact. While travel in the Middle Ages could be dangerous, especially for women, it was not uncommon for married women, particularly those with family ties across villages or towns, to travel during the winter if kin called, especially when childbirth was involved. Labour was considered a communal event among women, and visiting kin was both a moral duty and a spiritual encouragement. Your husband offers to go with you. You decline, not unkindly, just firmly. This is a women's journey, a quiet pilgrimage, one rooted in blood and blankets and whispered advice over steaming cups of something questionable. You pack light, bread, dried plums, a spare tunic, the St. Margaret medallion, and because your husband insists, the smaller turnip doll for companionship. The path to Lena's village is only a day away, but in winter, every mile feels like 2. You travel by cart, bumping along icy ruts the world around you, muffled by snow and silence. And as the village appears in the distance, smoke curling from its chimneys like sleepy prayers, something shifts in you, because as you enter Lena's cottage and she rushes into your arms, belly full and eyes shining, you remember. This is what came before the wedding. Laughter, stories, sisterhood. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval Flemish towns, pregnant women were gifted embroidered birth cloths, often made by female relatives. These cloths were used during labour, hung over cradles afterward, or even buried with the child if things went badly. They were stitched with prayers, flowers, stars, and occasionally messages like "push bravely" in suspiciously uneven Latin. You and Lena spend the next few days in that timeless space that only women seem to inhabit together. You boil water, rub aching backs, discuss recipes, discuss husbands, laugh at husbands. She asks if it's true that your turnip doll fell off the mantel and into the soup one night. You deny nothing. Historians still argue about the extent of these female networks in daily medieval life. But diaries, church records, and scattered marginalia in household books all suggest the same thing. Women were each other's first safety net. Long before doctors, long before priests, there were hands holding other hands. There were quiet rooms full of quiet strength. You stay until the first real snow threatens the road. Before you leave, Lena takes your hands. Her fingers are swollen, her face tired but fierce. "When it's your turn," she says, "I'll come." You nod, and though you don't say it aloud, part of you wonders if that turn will come at all. The road back is cold, but your chest is warm. And when your husband opens the door and pulls you inside, brushing snow from your shoulders, handing you hot cider and asking how Lena is before asking how you are, you realize you missed him. More than you expected, more than you'd admit. You sit by the fire that night with your boots off, your toes thawing, the turnip doll back in its rightful spot, and a new kind of weight in your bones. Not burden, not dread, just possibility. The snow deepens overnight, not the gentle kind that dusts windowsills and sprinkles rooftops like sugar, but the heavy, serious kind, the kind that silences everything, even gossip, even chickens. You wake to a world wrapped in white, the shutters frosted shut, the path buried. There's no firewood left inside. You and your husband spend the better part of the morning digging. It's not romantic. He curses when the axe handle slips. You mutter under your breath when the log pile turns out to be more snow than wood. At one point, he slips and lands in a heap, half buried, eyes closed like he's decided to nap rather than finish. You throw a snowball at him. It hits his ear. You both laugh. Eventually, later, indoors and steaming beside the hearth, he says, "Do you think this is what love looks like?" You glance at the pile of soggy boots by the door, the cracked kindling basket, and the faint smell of boiled onion that clings to everything, no matter what you do. Probably, you say, it's either love or seasonal cooperation. Let's place a mainstream historical fact. In the Middle Ages, especially in colder climates like northern England or the Alps, couples often spent entire winters largely confined together indoors, with little outside contact, short daylight hours, and chores focused on survival rather than ceremony. These months tested marriages more than any wedding feast ever could, but they also provided rare, unstructured time to know one another, not through ritual, but through repetition. You settle into winter. Evenings become long stretches of quiet, sewing, carding wool, rereading old prayers. Your husband tries to teach you how to carve a spoon. You pretend to care. He carves you one shaped like a lopsided fish. You declare it a masterpiece and hide it behind the spice jars. Visitors grow rare. Only the priest makes his weekly rounds, bundled like a walking haystack, always slipping on the last step, always pretending not to. He blesses the hearth again. You suspect he's just cold and hoping for soup. You begin to notice small things, how your husband hums while peeling onions, how he always checks the door twice before bed, how he has memorized exactly how much honey to stir into your cider without asking. And he begins to notice things too. When you frown at your sewing, he says, "It's not crooked, it's expressive." When your fingers are too cold to braid your hair, he does it for you. Badly, but still. Here's your quirky tidbit. In medieval Scandinavia, it was common for couples to carve small runes into shared objects during the winter months. Spoons, cups, bed frames, even window shutters. These weren't always romantic. Some read like grocery lists. Others were prayers. but a few were deeply personal messages, scratched into wood while one spouse slept nearby. One afternoon, while rearranging the logs, you find a message etched into the side of the firewood box. "This winter is easier because of you." Your husband denies it, of course. Historians still argue about the emotional lives of medieval couples. Some letters are cold, some are poetic, but most, are practical, filled with requests for turnips or updates about sheep. And yet in the margins you find warmth, a doodle, a joke, a nickname, traces of something deeper nestled among the routine. You start your own messages. A tiny heart scratched into the bread crust, a smiley face sewn into the corner of his undershirt, a fake letter addressed to His Royal Majesty King of Firewood Chopping. He laughs, you laugh. The world stays cold, but the house is warm, not because of the firewood, not entirely, because now, with the snow heavy and the path gone, no one is checking your linens, no one is asking questions, no one expects anything from you but survival. And what remains in the hush of the snow is just the two of you, wrapped in wool, soaked in soup, and slowly becoming something stronger than ceremony. Snow has a way of swallowing sound. By the end of the second week you can't hear the bells anymore, not the distant church chimes, not the gossip from the square, not even the creaky argument between the blacksmith's son and his hammer. Just wind, and the occasional thump of something sliding off the roof, which is either snow or a pigeon losing its footing again. Inside, your world is hushed. Even the turnip doll seems quieter now, slightly slumped, its red sash gone pale with dust and firelight. You consider giving it a bath, then decide that's probably how curses start. Your husband has developed a new hobby, making predictions. He points at the chimney smoke. If it goes straight up, snow's coming again. He stares at a sleeping cat in the neighbour's window. If the tail twitches, a guest will arrive. He pokes a crack in the plaster and solemnly announces, if that grows, we're doomed. You nod politely and hand him more soup. Let's take a moment for a mainstream historical fact. In the Middle Ages, long winters without much daylight or distraction gave rise to what some scholars call household folklore. Small beliefs and daily omens rooted in boredom as much as superstition. Families developed rituals for everything: when to light the hearth, which spoon to use first, even which sock to put on depending on the direction of the wind. It was a way to bring order to the quiet. You make up some folklore of your own. If the spoon falls twice in a day, someone's about to lie. If the cider foams over, you'll have unexpected guests. If you sleep with your feet touching, someone's in love. That last one you don't say aloud. But later that night, when your feet meet his under the blanket, and neither of you moves away, you wonder if he's thinking it too. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some 14th century Swiss villages, couples were encouraged to make winter vows, private promises whispered to one another during the long, dark season, when no priest was listening and no parchment was present. These vows weren't legal, they weren't witnessed, but they were remembered, often spoken again the following year, or carved into beams or hearthstones like fingerprints pressed into wood. You decide to make one, not aloud, just in your mind, as you watch your husband wrestle a stubborn log into the fire and then cheer for himself like he's slain a dragon. You think, next winter, I'll still be here. With him, through the snow, through the quiet, through the same joke about the rooster's seasonal depression. You say nothing, but you mean it. Historians still debate whether winter brought couples closer or drove them mad. There are love letters from snowed-in months that ache with longing and patience. But there are also court records detailing arguments over spoiled lentils and who forgot to dry the boots. As always, it was likely both. The cold reveals it doesn't choose sides. This evening, as the snow piles against the windows and the wind howls like an angry aunt, you both curl up on the floor by the fire, you with your mending, him with a spoon project that's suspiciously turning into a fork. He sighs. We've been in this house for 500 years. You glance at the window. 600, maybe. We should leave something behind, he says suddenly, for when the snow melts. You smile. Like what? He thinks, then pulls a coal from the hearth with a stick and gently draws a small symbol on the inside of the hearthstone. It's crooked, it's simple, it's yours. A little archway, a bed, 2 dots, 1 roof. It won't last the season. But that's not the point, because tonight you both needed to leave a mark, not for history, not for St. Margaret, not even for the turnip doll who now leans precariously on 1 foot, but for yourselves, to say, we were here, we kept warm, together. Thaw begins like a whisper. It starts with a drip from the eaves, from the corner of the shutter, from a place you didn't even realize had been holding snow. Then another. Then another. Soon it's a rhythm, a soft tapping on the windowsill, like the world gently knocking to see if you're still home. You are. You wake one morning to the sun, shy but present, peeking through a gap in the shutters. Your breath still clouds in the air, but the light hits your skin with the faintest memory of warmth. You blink against it like a bear blinking at spring. Outside, everything is slush and sparkle. The snow is retreating, slowly, sulkily, like a child asked to clean up a mess. Paths emerge, chickens emerge, so do neighbours, blinking and gossip-starved, eager to compare snow depths and ration regrets. You and your husband go out to walk, not far, just far enough to feel your boots sink into the soft ground, to breathe something that doesn't smell like onions or wool or soup. The air is sharp and new. He picks up a stick and pokes at the thawed earth, like a scientist. Worms, he declares, are prophets. You nod. What do they say? He squints. They say, plant beans and don't trust the goat. Let's place a mainstream historical fact. In the medieval agrarian calendar, the thaw marked the beginning of Plough Monday in many European regions, the first Monday after Epiphany when villagers resumed fieldwork. It was both a practical and symbolic re-entry into the outside world after winter's isolation, and often involved festivals, songs, and just a bit of competitive ploughing. Yes, competitive ploughing was a thing. You and your husband aren't quite ready for competitive anything, but you do sweep the threshold together. A symbolic act brushing away the last of the snow, the soot, the stale breath of winter. Inside, the house looks different in the new light. The curtains are opened wider, the bed is turned, the turnip doll is moved to a sunny shelf, now accompanied by a spoon with a fish handle and a suspiciously heart-shaped rock. You find yourself airing things out, blankets, thoughts, doubts. Things that winter held close now stretch their limbs and look around. Here's your quirky tidbit. In medieval Wales, couples would occasionally perform a spring blessing of the bed, which involved sprinkling herbs around the mattress, hanging clean linens in the sun, and reciting half prayers, half poems about fertility, prosperity, and peace. No one agrees on the exact words, but one 13th century fragment ends with, "And may the fleas be few." You perform your own version. You fluff the straw, wash the linens, sprinkle rosemary on the windowsill. You don't recite a poem, but you do hum a lullaby from childhood, the one about the green hills and the hidden sheep, and your husband joins in by the second verse, off-key but enthusiastic. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages strengthened in spring or faced new tests. The rhythm of shared work often helped, but with the return of festivals, markets, and extended social networks, temptations and distractions multiplied. In many village records, spring was also the season of scandals. Apparently, sunlight makes people ambitious, but not you, not now. You walk to the village well together, hands brushing. You nod at neighbours. You swap soup recipes with the baker's wife and return a borrowed ladle you'd honestly forgotten you borrowed. Life resumes. But it's different now, not just because of the thaw, because this winter you didn't just survive. You softened, you bent toward each other like frostbitten branches thawing in tandem. You learned the quiet shape of your marriage, the space between words, the importance of socks that actually match. That evening, as the fire crackles low and the wind outside sounds more curious than cruel, your husband turns to you and says, "I'm glad it was you." And you don't ask what he means because you already know. Spring doesn't announce itself, it just stops being winter. One morning, you step outside and realize the ground doesn't crunch anymore. The mud clings instead of cracking. The birds, not just crows, but birds that sound like they have opinions, have returned. Somewhere, a goat bleats in existential confusion. And in the hedgerow? Green. Tiny, almost rude green. Your husband spots it first and gasps like he's seen a miracle, which, to be fair, he kind of has. It's been months since anything has grown. You kneel down beside the hedge, fingertips brushing the fragile shoots. He kneels too. Do we bless it? He whispers. No, you say. We leave it alone and pretend we know what we're doing. He nods solemnly. Classic parenting approach. The season turns gently, and with it, your roles shift again. Let's tuck in a mainstream historical fact. In medieval peasant households, spring was when women took on a surprising variety of tasks, not only sewing and cooking, but overseeing planting, maintaining herb gardens, tending animals just born, and assisting with local healing if they had knowledge of herbs. Marriage was, in many ways, a working partnership. And when spring arrived, so did responsibility. You begin airing out your herbs, shaking out the dust and regret of winter. You plant early greens, onions, mustard leaf, cress. Your hands find their rhythm in the soil again. You catch your husband talking to the seedlings, gently, like he's explaining taxes to them. Grow now, he says, or I'll cry. The days grow longer, you move more, you talk more, the village stirs, the market begins to murmur. There's news of a festival soon, small, muddy, half forgotten from last year, but a festival nonetheless. You both pretend not to be excited, you try on your best tunic, it shrank. Or maybe you've wintered, as the baker's wife says, with a knowing pat of her belly. You try his best belt on him. It fits, sort of. We're festival ready, he declares, as long as no one expects us to dance or stay awake past sundown. You laugh, but later that night you do try a few steps, slowly. In the kitchen, he offers his hand, you take it. 1, 2, 1, 2, someone trips. It's unclear who. Here's your quirky tidbit. In certain medieval French villages, springtime brought bed dances, ceremonial and often humorous, mock dances performed around the couple's bed to celebrate surviving the winter without murdering each other. Neighbours would bring wine, honey, and unsolicited advice. It was part roast, part blessing, and entirely embarrassing. You pray your village doesn't remember that tradition, but you do bake a cake. Of sorts, more a bread with pretensions. Slightly sweet, slightly burned, slightly cursed. Your husband declares it the best thing he's eaten in months, which is either very sweet or deeply insulting to your soup. Historians still argue whether these small rituals, spring planting, market rejoining, festivals, even the awkward dancing, were part of the marriage ceremony itself or simply the continuation of life. But one thing is clear, after the vows, after the feast, after the wedding night, what truly sealed a union was what came next. The quiet seasons, the mundane days, the soup, the slush, the laughter that came not from excitement, but recognition. One morning you find him outside early. He's holding a flower. Well, technically a weed, but he's holding it like it's a relic. He tucks it behind your ear. You stare at him. That's a dandelion. It's your dandelion. You roll your eyes, but you leave it there, because somehow, over the course of endless bowls of broth and 1,000 silent mornings, something tender has grown between you. Not dramatic, not noble, but real. Like spring. Spring deepens. What was once a hint of green becomes a chorus. The trees fluff out with newborn leaves. Birds begin waking you up again, loudly, rudely, unapologetically, alive. Even the chickens seem more smug, strutting like they personally invented eggs. Your chores change with the light. The rhythm shifts. You're up earlier, and so is he. You trade thick wool for thinner layers. The air smells less like firewood and more like possibility. The village buzzes in that gently chaotic way that says everyone is trying to remember how to socialize again. You walk to the market together. The path is muddy, but it's your mud now, familiar and clinging to your boots like an old friend. He offers you his arm as if you're some noble lady. You accept, with the full knowledge that you're both going to fall in the cabbage stall again. Let's slip in a mainstream historical fact. In medieval England and parts of France, many marriages were formed or renewed around spring festivals, especially on or near May Day. This period symbolized fertility, abundance, and fresh beginnings. Some couples would even reaffirm vows informally, not at church, but under trees beside wells, or in the middle of dances that blurred the line between tradition and intoxication. You arrive at the village square and it's blooming with noise, and there's a juggler who drops everything. There's music with only 2 correct notes. There's bread that costs more than it did last fall and tastes worse somehow. But the air is soft and full of dust and someone's perfume, and it all feels vibrant. Your husband wins you a ribbon by accident. He meant to win a chicken. The ribbon is blue. He ties it around your wrist like a knight bestowing a favour, then immediately gets distracted by honey cakes. He buys 2, drops 1, eats both. You don't mind. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of 13th century Bohemia, it was common for newly married couples to sit back to back in the middle of the spring festival and answer absurd questions from villagers. Things like, who sings better? Or who snores louder? If they disagreed, the couple was pelted with flower petals. If they agreed, they were pelted with bread. Either way, it was a mess. You and your husband avoid the game, barely. Instead, you sit under a blooming tree, sharing a piece of soft cheese and people watching. He nudges you. Look, he says, there's that baker's son, the one who danced with the broom last year. You laugh. He looks taller now. Still dances like a broom. There's a softness in his voice you've come to recognize, the kind that comes after long silence, after deep snow, after soup and splinters and inside jokes, the kind that says, we made it. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages grew over time or simply settled, like dust or bread dough or a very tired dog. But when you lean your head on his shoulder and he doesn't shift away, doesn't joke, doesn't say anything at all, you understand it's not about growing or settling. It's about belonging. You don't need a priest to remind you. You don't need a crowd to witness it. You only need each other. And a spring day, a crooked smile, and a ribbon that still smells faintly of beeswax and luck. As the sun lowers and the music softens, you both rise and begin the walk home. There is mud, there is laughter, and there is you side by side, no longer wondering what marriage is supposed to feel like. You already know. The days grow longer still. Sunlight lingers like a guest who doesn't know when to leave, stretching through the windows, touching everything with that soft gold that makes even the dust motes look poetic. The evenings arrive gently now, not like a slap of cold, but like an exhale. You find yourself moving more slowly, not from exhaustion, but from permission. There's no longer a sense of urgency. The wedding has long passed. The feast has faded into gossip. Even the old midwife, who once inspected your linens like a knight inspecting armor, has stopped asking questions and started asking for soup. You tend the garden together. He digs, you sow. Sometimes he sows and you watch, pretending not to critique. The weeds know your names. So do the bees. A few even seem to favor your husband's ear. One afternoon, you catch him napping in the doorway, the cat curled across his chest like a smug scarf. His mouth is slightly open. A dandelion seed lands on his lip. He sneezes and startles both of you. You laugh so hard you nearly drop the pie. Let's plant our mainstream historical fact. By late spring, most medieval couples would have settled fully into their household rhythms. Legal marriage was less about the ceremony and more about ongoing public acknowledgement. Neighbours saw you as wed, you behaved as wed, you functioned as a unit. The community became your witness. No parchment needed. And that's what's happened. No one doubts you now. You're not newlyweds anymore. You're just you. The couple with the slanted chimney, the thriving turnips, the suspiciously well-fed chickens, and the cat who answers to both Lord Meowgret and Hey You. And somewhere in all of it, in the daily bread, in the gentle teasing, in the quiet brushing of shoulders as you hang laundry, you realize you've stopped thinking of this life as borrowed. It's yours. Here's a final quirky tidbit. In some medieval German towns, couples who made it through their first year of marriage were gifted a small carved figure by a neighbor, often something simple, like a pig or a hen or a thumb-sized man with a hat. These were placed on the mantel to ward off arguments, or at least to remind them that someone was watching. You receive a carved goat from the priest. It's awful. One eye is bigger than the other. Its legs are uneven. Your husband names it Sir Argument. You place it on the mantel with pride. Historians still debate whether love, as we understand it, played a central role in medieval marriage. The records are contradictory, the letters are sparse, but the daybooks, the account ledgers, the margins of prayer books, they whisper of laughter, small surprises, tenderness not declared but lived. You don't need the scholars to tell you. You have proof in your spoons, in your slanted hearth, in the ribbon still tucked in your drawer, and in the way he reaches for your hand in sleep, not because he's afraid, not because it's expected, but because that's where his hand belongs. The moonlight filters through the shutter cracks. You lie in bed, listening to the soft hush of the world outside, the steady breath beside you, the cooling embers sighing in the hearth. And you smile, not because the story was perfect, but because it was yours. So now, as the story slows and the moon climbs higher, you let your breath fall in sync with the quiet all around you. The house you built in your mind is still there, soft edges glowing in the firelight, the garden resting, the shutters gently creaking like an old lullaby. The floorboards remember every step, every shared joke, every time you danced badly on purpose. And the bed? The bed remembers too, not just the wedding night, but all the nights after, the ordinary ones, the cold ones, the ones filled with soup and silence and one too many blankets. The ones where love wasn't declared. It was practiced, folded into laundry, stirred into porridge, whispered in sighs and shared space. You've walked through a year of medieval life together now, one soft step at a time, through feasts and frost, awkward neighbours and muddy paths, through a world that didn't always offer choice, but still made space for care. And as the world outside fades to grey, and your eyes grow heavy, you carry none of the weight, just the warmth. Let the past settle around you like a second blanket. Let the sounds soften into hush. Let the stories rest now, as you do. You made it through the winter, and spring is yours.